Order. Order. I call Philip Davis to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr Gapes. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered the matter of male suicide and International Men's Day. And I would like to thank the colleagues across the House for supporting the holding of this debate, and also the Backbench Business Committee for finding time to hold the debate on International Men's Day itself. I'd also like to thank all the very many people who have been in touch with me to tell their story or to put forward their organisation's point of view. And I'm very grateful to all of them for taking the time to do that. Mr Gapes, I said in my maiden speech that I would campaign hard against the blight of political correctness, which is doing so much damage to our country. 10 years have passed, and I'm still here fighting this battle. Some of the most ludicrous cases of political correctness have reduced, but the more entrenched ones are still well and truly thriving. And one of the main areas where we see the pernicious effects of political correctness is when it comes to the treatment of men and women. And I heard about International Men's Day and decided that it was only right, given that we have a debate each year on International Women's Day, in the interests of gender parity, to try to appeal for time to be given for this debate to commemorate this day. The aims of International Men's Day are admirable. They are to promote positive male role models, not just movie stars and sportsmen, but everyday working-class men who are living decent, honest lives, to celebrate men's positive contributions to society, community, family, marriage, childcare and to the environment, to focus on men's health and well-being, social, emotional, physical and spiritual, to highlight discrimination against men in areas of social services, social attitudes and expectations and the law, and to improve gender relations and promote gender equality, and finally to create a safer, better world where people can be safe and grow to reach their full potentials. Of course I will.
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and can I commend him for securing this as an important debate? And he's just outlined the importance of International Men's Day. Would he not share my disappointment that this debate should be held on the floor of the House of Commons rather than in the second chamber in Westminster Hall?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for coming to the debate and also for making that point. And yes, I would have preferred the debate to be in the main chamber, especially given as International Women's Day debate is held there too. But I'm grateful that we've got an opportunity to raise these issues, which we've never done before. So it would be churlish for me to be too critical, given that we've got the time for this debate today. But I want today to be the day that we in this House start to deal with some of the forgotten men's issues and realise why the political correctness which underpins issues relating to the differing treatment of the sexes can be damaging to men. Now, this might sound odd for someone leading a debate on International Men's Day, but in many respects, Mr Gapes, I would rather we did not have to be here to have this debate. Because when you think about it, in so many ways, considering men and women separately, as if they live lives in complete isolation to each other, is ridiculous. Neither group is isolated. Both sexes have mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, uncles and aunts, grandmothers and grandfathers, sons and daughters, husbands and wives, boyfriends and girlfriends. So for every woman there are related male parties and therefore a vested interest in men's issues. The problem is that in virtually everything we do in this House and debate in this House seems to start with the premise that everything is biased against women and something must be done about it. Never an appreciation that men's issues can be just as important and that men can be just as badly treated in certain areas as women. My honourable friend, the member for Belfast East, supported my request for a debate, and I know he is very sorry that he unfortunately could not be here today to join in. But had he been here, no doubt he would have shared the fact that last year Belfast City Council hosted its first event to mark International Men's Day. This was, I understand, held in Belfast Castle, opened by the First Minister and the Lord Mayor of Belfast, Nicola Mallon, following a proposal by Alderman Ruth Patterson. It seems our Ulster friends had this event appreciating that there are some specifically male issues that should be addressed with both sexes involved. And I want to be very clear, I don't believe that there is actually an issue between men and women. I think that often the problems are stirred up by those who might be described as militant feminists and the politically correct males who sometimes pander to it. And you don't just need to take my word for it. Before the Equal Opportunities Commission was merged into the Equality and Human Rights Commission, it conducted research which found that women had very clear views on these matters. Their findings included the following conclusion. There was little support for the idea that women as a group are unequal in society today. Presumably that went down like a lead balloon in an organisation dedicated to fighting for women's interests and rights, and so it was pretty much swept under the carpet. And one of the most depressing things to happen, in my opinion, was the introduction of the Select Committee for Women and Equalities. After everything else, in 2015, we have a separate committee to deal with women's issues, on top of the Women's Minister, Women's Question Time, and the many strategies in the country which only deal with women. Now, again, for the record, Mr Gapes, I want to be clear that I couldn't care less if every MP in this House was female or if every member of my staff were female, as long as they were there on merit. And I want to say that to assume that men can't adequately represent women is a nonsense, just as it's to say that only women can represent other women. As a man, I can say quite clearly that Margaret Thatcher represented my views very nicely indeed. But I'm not sure she would have been the pin-up to many of the politically correct left-leaning women who are obsessed with having more women in Parliament today. It seems to me that we've therefore got this equality but only when it suits agenda in Parliament that often applies just to women. The drive for women to have so-called equality on all things that suit the politically correct agenda, but not on the things that don't, is a great concern. So, for example, we hear plenty about increasing the number of women on company boards and female representation in Parliament, but there's a deafening silence when it comes to increasing the number of men who have custody of their children or who have careers as midwives. In fact, generally there seems to be a deafening silence on all the benefits women have compared to men. Yes, of course.
Would you add to that list the deafening silence about the shortage of male teachers in primary schools, very important male role models?
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right about that. And again, we hear very little about that. If there was a great shortage of female primary school teachers, I suspect we would hear a great deal more about it. The fight for the version of equality on all things that suit women it ends up with a situation that we're very quick to point out that women need special protections and treatment on certain things, but want greater equality on other. And let me give an example of prison uniforms. Men in prison have to wear a prison uniform. Women in prison do not. How, I have asked on many occasions, can that possibly be fair? Where is the equality in that? And I'll come on to the treatment of men and women in our justice system a bit later. But this is a very clear issue. What is the explanation? I'm told that it's because women are different. So, as I said, equality, but only when it suits. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you for giving way. Congratulations on security. I may not agree with everything he said up to now, but one thing I do agree very much with him on is the constant obsession around gender equality. Does he not agree with me that actually some of the people who have the worst life outcomes in our area, in particular, are working class men who suffer some of the worst health and have some of the poorest life chances, and that simply replacing one middle-class privately educated man with a middle-class privately educated woman is doing very little to increase the diversity and opportunity for working-class lads.
Well, I very much agree with my honourable friend, and I think increasingly working-class boys are some of the ones who are doing the worst at school and need the most help, and I certainly agree with him in that regard in terms of political representation. I've often said that replacing Rupert from Kensington and Chelsea with Jemima from Kensington and Chelsea doesn't do much for diversity in the House of Commons, but that's perhaps a debate for another day. Of course, there are some people who believe that only men can be sexist. Francis Crook of the Howard League for Penal Reform, for example, tweeted the following a few years ago. Sexism is not about choosing between two genders, it's about historic and current oppression by men. Only men can be sexist. This is not uncommon, but it is, I believe, unguided. A good example of this, with regard to sexism, is my view that if it's not okay for a man to be sexist, then it cannot be okay to be sexist as a woman. A good example of this is positive discrimination, which is portrayed as a great thing, a rebalancer for oppressed females. Yet it is just discrimination, whether you put the word positive in front of it or not. It is still discrimination. In my opinion, there is absolutely nothing positive at all about positive discrimination, and it's certainly nothing to do with equality. Just a few months ago, a publishing house declared that they were not going to accept any male authors for a year to redress some perceived discrimination against female authors. I never quite understood that because, as far as I can see, there are plenty of published female authors. But leaving that aside, people were commending the publishers for their stance. Now, just imagine if another publisher had said that they were not going to publish female authors. There would be an outcry. Thankfully, the Equality and Human Rights Commission agreed with me that this would be unlawful when I put in a complaint to them about it. But it's interesting to note the number of people whose mind this clearly did not cross, because this was in favour of women. They thought it was fine. Now, I will give way.
Well, I was very grateful seeing this motion on the order paper to do with male suicide and male mental health, which is why I came along today, and I know some of my colleagues have done so. I would be very grateful, as I think I disagree with some of the points he has been making about the broader equality agenda, but could we perhaps move on to the conversation about male mental health, where I think there are some very important things to be said?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. If she'd been a little more patient, I was just coming on to male suicide, but I was setting the context in which this debate, which is also, if she looks at the order paper, is about International Men's Day, and it's not just limited to male suicide. But as it happens, if she'd just been a little more patient, I am now actually coming on to the issue of male suicide, but I'm glad I've been able to set the scene, and I'm sorry that actually pointing out that men are sometimes badly treated in the world is so discomforting for to have to listen to, but that's part of the problem we have in this House. The motion... Yes, I will.
Does the honourable gentleman agree with me that gender politics needs to be more collaborative in style, and that we shouldn't be antagonising either sex in order to achieve equality? Real equality is not achieved by causing upset or offence to either men or women.
I very much agree, and I hope that this will be part of the day that men's issues were treated as importantly in this House as female issues. And if that's what my honourable friend is saying, I'm all for it, and I hope that this debate helps us move that on. Now, the motion we are debating today, as my honourable friend pointed out, specifically mentions male suicide. And I wanted to deal with this subject in particular, as suicide is desperately sad, and it's clear that more men than women take their own lives each year. In fact, the figures show that around 3/4 of all people who commit suicide are men. And I would like to place on record the fact that whilst men are more likely to commit suicide than women, those left behind grieving will be from both sexes, and often children too. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Lynn Moon.
Thank you, Mr Gapes. Can I point out to everyone in the room, please, that no one in this country committed suicide since 1961, when suicide was no longer a crime. You commit murder, you commit burglary, you commit arson, you don't commit suicide. You take your own life, but you don't commit. Commit is a word that relates to a crime. Suicide is not a crime.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for picking me up again. This is, as far as I can see, a terminology. It may be important to some people, but I'm afraid if I'm going to be chastised for using the word that is used by every member of the public, as far as I can see, whenever they discuss this issue, I do apologise. But let's not get bogged down, if we don't mind, in politically correct terminology. I'd much prefer we actually dealt with the issue that I'm trying to raise. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you very much for giving way. Can I just say, as somebody who has had a member of family commit suicide, I'm perfectly happy with the use of that term, and I do think it's politically correct to talk about some other terminology to make it more acceptable to others.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that. Let's hope... Well, as long as we're going to get onto a serious debate about the issue, then I will give way to the honourable... I know she knows a lot about this issue. If she wants to make a sensible point, I'll be very happy to give way to her.
I only ever do make sensible points on the issue of suicide, on which I do spend a considerable amount of my time. I can tell the honourable gentleman that for many families who have been blighted by suicide, this word is deeply offensive, and it does cause great distress because it's part of a feeling of alienation and criminality that enters their family, and it is, for them, an issue of great sensitivity. And I'm sorry the honourable gentleman is rolling his eyes, but that's the reality.
Well, again, the Honourable Lady's made a point. I would rather that we actually dealt with trying to prevent people from taking their own lives or committing suicide or whatever term anybody wants to use. The end result is the same, and that's perhaps the thing that we ought to concentrate on most, rather than just focusing somewhat on what we've called it, which doesn't actually necessarily help anybody who is actually a victim of it. According to the Office for National Statistics, the number of female suicide victims had reduced from 10.9 per thousand in 1982 to 5.1 per thousand in 2013. Male suicide rates in the UK were much higher, and virtually the same in 2013 as they were in 1982, 19 per thousand in 2013 and 20.6 per thousand in 1992. Whilst these statistics sound bad enough, this is nothing compared to the reality of suicide. According to the House of Commons Library, what this means is that in 2012, over 4,500 men felt they had no choice but to take their own lives. Given that there was an increase in suicides in 2013, the figure for that year is nearly 5,000 men. In fact, over the last 30 years, according to the Office of National Statistics figures supplied by the House of Commons Library, there have been over 130,000 men who have taken their own lives. This is a staggering number of people who have needlessly died, and a staggering number of families left behind, parents, spouses, children, friends, colleagues, all of whom left grieving and suffering. In fact, I will.
Thank you for giving way. And in our own county in Yorkshire, 81% of those deaths from suicide in 2013 were men. And taking back to the point I intervened on earlier, does it not agree with me that we've got to do more to intervene earlier, particularly on young men from the poorest social backgrounds who are the most at risk on this, either through unemployment, through low self-esteem caused by low educational outcomes, or through the social conditions in which they live. And again, this is a particular group of our society who the services are not necessarily best placed to respond to, but who we need to do better as a nation in intervening earlier.
Well, I'm sure, Mr Gates, that my honourable friend is right, and I'm sure most people would agree with him about that. In fact, in the time allocated to this debate, statistically at least one man will have taken his own life, which means that yet another life will have been ended prematurely and another family will have been left devastated. According to the Campaign Against Living Miserably, which is supported by many individual charities and who I'd like to thank for their help with today's debate, a YouGov poll this month, which surveyed 2,000 men, found that 42% had considered suicide, with 41% never talking to anyone about their problems. 49% of those who didn't seek help didn't want people to worry about me. A third felt ashamed. Nearly 4 in 10 did not want to make a fuss. And 43% didn't want to talk about their feelings. According to various sources, including the government's suicide prevention strategy for England, the suicide rate is highest among males aged 30 to 59. This has fluctuated in recent years between 30 and 44, but it's currently those who are 45 to 59 who have the highest suicide rate. So we might ask, why do these men feel that they have to end their lives in these numbers? There is the obvious issue of mental health, and not wanting to ask for help could mean that this goes untreated in some men. The Royal College of Psychiatrists sent me a briefing which said 3/4 of all people who end their own life are not in contact with mental health services, and men who are suffering from depression are much less likely than women to look for formal help from mental health professionals. There are also clearly other things that are likely to affect men more than women, for example, being in debt or being a war veteran. The Samaritans point to evidence that suicidal behaviour comes about as a result of a complex interaction of a number of factors. In the case of men, financial worries play a big part, so unemployment and redundancy can be a trigger, and also the influence of a historical culture of masculinity. In some cases, men might feel, usually mistakenly, that they are a burden on others, or that people would be better off if they were dead. The fact that men see themselves as being the providers still in many cases means that financial hardship is very significant, and in their mind reduces their contribution to the family unit. In the case of someone in debt, they might think that their family would be better off if they were not there. Even putting aside the enormous emotional loss of those left behind, the financial gain may not be as the person maybe intends, as the taking their own life can invalidate their life assurance. Of course, I'll give way.
Thank you very much for giving away. giving way. A moment ago, he mentioned the importance of mental health care for men and men accessing mental health. One thing that is well known is that men may well go to A&E seeking care when they have mental health needs, and often A&E is the only place that's available in the middle of the night. And although some hospitals have got good care in the form of psychiatric liaison teams, many hospitals do not have good psychiatric liaison services, and these are known to be very helpful. I know that the Minister supports this kind of service and there is some funding going towards it, but can I ask that it is made sure that this funding does make sure that there is good psychiatric liaison services in all hospitals and transparency about the level of those services so people like ourselves can make sure that they are effective.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention, and I'm sure we all hope that the Minister will address that particular point when he comes to make his contribution to the debate. Shockingly, Mr Gates, 56.1% of men commit suicide by hanging themselves. I cannot imagine the horror of finding someone who has hanged themselves. Add to that the fact that this person is a loved one, and it's even more tragic. And then there are all the questions that inevitably arise following a suicide from the person's loved ones. Why? Why didn't I know there was something wrong? Why didn't they talk to me? Why did they leave me? What could I have done to prevent this from happening? The guilt and sense of loss that those left behind must feel after someone has killed themselves should be reason enough to want to do something. Never mind the absolute waste of life of the individual concerned. Suicides account for more deaths than road traffic accidents, and so you would expect the government to be trying to tackle this issue. Sometimes this place is also about sending out signals or messages. And the message I want to go out loud and clear today for anyone contemplating suicide is that you are not alone. There is nothing whatsoever weak or wrong in seeking help, and there are plenty of people out there who can help you. So please talk to someone, confidentially and anonymously if you prefer, but please talk to someone. Suicide is never the right option. The Royal College of Psychiatrists says we also need to work towards building a society where people should not be afraid to seek help for fear of being stigmatised, and where the media agree to responsible reporting of suicide. I couldn't agree more. And they say it's also important that information on depression and how men can get support is available in what might be traditionally considered male settings, such as football stadiums, barbers or pubs. And again, that seems like a very good idea to me too. Suicide, especially in the numbers we see for men, is a huge tragic problem and something we really need to work together on to change. One of the things that leads men to contemplate suicide is the breakdown of a relationship, especially where there are children involved. It's quite clear that the courts are more likely to place children with the mother over the father. This is certainly a massive area where men face very different treatment to women. I really do think we underestimate the effect on fathers of having to battle to see their children and facing the inevitable likelihood that they will come worse off simply because of their gender. I'm certainly not saying that all cases are like this. Many, many reasonable mothers allow their father as much access to the children as possible, and we should always recognise that. But life isn't always that simple in every relationship. Some women do use their children as a stick to beat the father with, either because they're bitter about the failed relationship, for financial reasons, or because they've moved on and it's easier for them if their new partner takes on the role of father to their children. Women can fail to put the father on the birth certificate, limiting his right, or lie to him about whether or not he is even the father. Short of a child swapping disaster in hospital, women know for sure that their babies are their own. But fathers can never know 100% for sure that this is the case without formally having a DNA test. Many are sure because of their trust in their partner, but there are also plenty who will be unsure because of their partner's behaviour or because they have been deliberately tricked. I've received numerous messages on the subject of fathers and their children, and unfortunately, Mr Gates, we don't have time to go through them all. But I just wanted to read out one or two which contain the points many people made and which link the serious issues of fathers not having access to their children to the issue of suicide. One said, "Dear Mr Davis, a number of local fathers have been in touch with our MP, as I have over the years, about the way fathers are routinely excluded from their children's lives or treated very differently from mothers. I was pleased to hear that he helped. This was from the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for Kettering, and this person pointed out that they were delighted that he had helped to secure this debate today. It's been proved time and again that children benefit from parenting by both their parents after separation, but it's all too easy for false allegations to be made in an attempt to exclude fathers. There are rarely any repercussions, and it can be many months before broken relationships with children can be mended, if ever. Sadly, I know of a number of men who have been driven to suicide as a result of their experience. Many fathers I meet at the local meeting I chair have mental health problems associated with separation and the difficulties they have experienced. And that's aside from other members of their families, including, of course, grandfathers, of whom my husband is one. I do hope something positive comes from the debate on Thursday. That's from Jenny Cutris, the chair of Families Need Fathers branch in Kettering. Messages from other people on the subject include those saying, I've spent the last 4 years going through the family courts trying to maintain a decent relationship with my children. Over and over again, my ex has been emotionally abusing my daughter and alienating me from her life. She has also maliciously claimed domestic violence and taken out a non-molestation order against me to try and stop me from having contact or being involved in my daughter's life in retaliation to me getting my ex's mother arrested for assault as she attacked me inside a court building. I was aware of the stories about men's chances when it comes to custody of their children for some time, and so last February I asked the Ministry of Justice this question: in what proportion of all cases heard in family courts, where both the mother and the father sought custody of their children, the residence order was awarded to A, the mother, B, the father, and C, jointly? The answer from the Minister was that the information does not record details of the orders, such as which parties were awarded the order. The information requested can only be obtained at disproportionate costs. But from everything I've heard, including from those who actually do the adjudicating in family courts, it seems that it takes something out of the ordinary for men to be awarded custody of their children, and it seems that the Ministry of Justice can't say otherwise. And the Equality Act clearly doesn't seem to apply in this area. If people think men have life easy, then they really need to think again when it comes to families. Women have an awful lot of control, and there is an inbuilt bias towards them when it comes to the very important job of raising children. And it doesn't look as if this is going to change anytime soon. Yet, as someone wrote in a message to me, I really believe that if the system worked against women the way it works against men, there would be hell on about it. Whenever there is any discussion of gender equality, the focus is solely on women being disadvantaged and never about these inequalities or those that you yourself raise or the many other areas where men are disadvantaged. The fact that women usually take responsibility for childcare is often cited as an obstacle to women's progression in their careers and underrepresentation in senior roles, and I believe that society's perceptions and family law appear to be perpetuating this issue. Perhaps more equality in family law and wider society could provide a win-win for both sexes, which seemed to me like a very good point. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Gentleman for giving way. I'm very grateful to him for securing this important debate, but I do feel that the evidence he's just presented has been anecdotal and there is no concrete evidence. You've just given us individual cases, and I am concerned that this discussion is straying down a slightly misogynistic streak.
Well, I'm sorry the Honourable Lady feels like that. Again, this is part of the politically correct culture we have in this place. At the moment anybody raises anything that affects men, people are accused of being misogynists. That is absolutely part of the problem. The Honourable Lady is part of the problem. Why these issues never get debated. Because it's raised as something to try and deter anybody from ever raising their head above the parapet. There are lots of people in her constituency that are affected by these issues. And perhaps she ought to go and consult some of her constituents about the issues that they face in these areas, and she may learn that it's right to raise these issues in Parliament. It's not misogynistic to raise the issues that some fathers in her constituency have in having trouble getting custody or access to their children. If she doesn't think that's a problem, then I think she needs to get out more, perfectly frankly. I will give way.
Can we conduct this debate in a civil manner without it degenerating into some kind of arguments of that kind? I just ask all members, please, can we get back to the subject of the debate? I think this was an intervention.
It was. Thank you, Mr.
Walker.
Gates. My honourable friend has never been afraid to put his head above the parapet, and I think he is raising some very important issues today. We may not all agree with every point he makes, but actually I think he is raising some very important issues, particularly when it comes to family breakdown and suicide. But would he agree when it comes to the issue of men's role in the family, reforms to create equal parental leave are important in fostering that role, and it's vitally important that the government continues to pursue things like the family tests to ensure that we try to avoid the causes of family breakdown, which are a great problem for men as well as for women, in every opportunity we can.
Well, I very much agree with my honourable friend that we need to do more to make sure that we have genuine equality, not the equality when it suits a gender, and that we need to do as much as possible to help families stay together wherever that's possible. Absolutely. Now, on to violence, Mr. Gapes. In this House, we always seem to be hearing about strategies for combating violence against women and girls. In fact, there have been specific debates in this House on just this very subject. And so people might be forgiven for thinking that there is a special problem in relation to violence against women and girls, which does not apply to men and boys. Some might think that there must be far more women and girls who are victims of violence than men and boys as a result. But the reality does not always match the concerns people seem to have. It's a fact that in this country, men are much more likely to be victims of violent crime than women. The Ministry of Justice's most recent biennial statistics on the representation of females and males in the criminal justice system confirmed that 1.4% of women interviewed in the crime survey reported being a victim of a violent crime, compared to 2.3% of men. And it's not just when considering violence generally where men do worse than women. Women accounted for around 30% of all recorded homicide victims between 2006-7 and 2012-13, while men were the victims in the remaining 70% of cases. The picture emerging here is that men and boys are by far the more likely victims of violence and murders than women and girls, and yet there is little or no mention of them in the debates we have had and the strategies that have been drawn up in relation to females. So I asked the following question of the Secretary of State for Education in Parliament last November: what her policy is on educating children about violence against men and boys. I also asked what her policy is on educating boys about domestic violence against men and boys. The reply from the Schools Minister was that education has an important role to play in encouraging young people to build healthy relationships and to identify those relationships which are unhealthy. Pupils may be taught about violence against men and boys in personal, social, health and economic education. And so I will just leave that there for people to reflect on. There has also been a lot of talk about domestic violence and the female victims of violence in that context. The Office of National Statistics show that 8.5% of women were victims of domestic violence in 2013-14, but so were 4.5% of men. That's equivalent to 1.4 million female victims, but around about 700,000 male victims of domestic violence. This figure does not refer to partner abuse, but to all abuse in a domestic setting, including amongst families. And when you look at the figures for partner abuse, 5.9% of women and 2.9% of men report being victims. So it's quite clear from this that around 1 in 3 victims are men. Yes.
I think he's I wanted to make a speech, but I've got constituents visiting. He's making a really important point about domestic violence towards men, but the fact still remains most domestic violence is towards women. So does he agree with me that actually, whilst we should tackle that, International Men's Day is the perfect opportunity for men to stand up as part of the White Ribbon campaign, which I'm pleased to be an ambassador for, to say that we will never remain silent as men when other men commit violence against women. Both of them are really important, and raising the issue of domestic violence to men is important. But International Men's Day offers a particular opportunity for men to take a stand against other men who commit violence against women.
Absolutely. My honourable friend is absolutely right. All such violence is unacceptable, whoever the perpetrator is, whether it's a male perpetrator or a female perpetrator, whether it's a male victim or a female victim. And that is absolutely my point 100%. We should criticise them all equally. There is also evidence of underreporting amongst male victims of domestic violence. In the crime survey for England and Wales, victims of partner abuse in the previous 12 months were asked who they had spoken to about the abuse they experienced. A third of all victims told someone in an official position about the abuse. but nearly twice as many women as men did, and perhaps even more significantly, women were nearly 3 times more likely to tell the police than men. So despite what we might think, given the focus there is on male perpetrators of domestic violence, there are also many female perpetrators. And when anyone says domestic violence, the first thing that springs to most people's mind, including my own, Mr. Gapes, is a poor woman being attacked by a bullying man. Yet the figures show that it's much more complex than that, and this stereotypical image needs to be smashed if we're to tackle the problem as a whole. Something else that needs to change is the reaction to violence against males, certainly when it becomes to female-on-male violence. For some, it's almost seen as a laughing matter, yet nobody would be laughing or turning a blind eye if the female was victim. There is anecdotal evidence which suggests that male victims are treated differently to female victims by the police and other agencies. Given the sheer numbers involved, male victims are also hardly given any resources compared to female victims. There should be resources available to both male and female victims of domestic violence. Issues like the lack of places of refuge and the lack of support for men is something which needs to be addressed. For example, the Mankind Initiative, which works with men suffering from domestic violence or domestic abuse, says it will run out of funding in January. They need people to back them now so they can provide the emotional support and practical information to male victims. There are moving stories from men who have suffered domestic violence on their website. And despite the fact that they may seem to be more female victims of domestic abuse, each male victim is also a person and not a statistic. It's only right and fair that help should be there for victims of both sentences. The final issue, Mr. Gapes, I've gone on longer than I thought because I've taken so many interventions, but one final issue I want to raise is about sentencing and how men are treated differently to women in our criminal justice system. I had a debate here in Westminster Hall 3 years ago when I had plenty of statistical evidence to show that women were treated more leniently than men, but that didn't seem to be accepted at the time. Since then, progress has been made because this fact is now broadly accepted. For far too long, those who had been peddling myths had been able to get away with it because people had simply repeated their mantra without question. People now might want to try and explain why women should be treated more favourably in the criminal justice system, but at least people now accept that they are. Since that debate, I've also amassed much more evidence on the subject, and I won't go through all of that now as we'd be here all day, but I do want to put some of the key facts on the record. About 5% of the prison population at any one time in recent history has been female. The other 95% has been male. Yet there has always been so much consternation, time and effort exuded over the very small number of women in prison. For every category of offence, men are more likely to be sent to prison than women. That is a fact. Just to give an example to illustrate this, 45% of men sentenced for an offence of violence against the person will be given a custodial sentence, compared to just 23% of women. Of those with 15 or more previous convictions, 39% of men, but only 29% of women are sent to immediate custody. In Crown Courts, dealing with the most serious offences, probation recommends immediate custody in 24% of cases for male offenders and just 11% of those with female offenders. The average sentence length for indictable offences is 17.7 months for men, 11.6 months for women. Men serve on average 52% of their prison sentence, women serve on average 46%. The average time spent in a prison cell by men in a day was 14.1 hours, it was 11.5 hours for women. The list is endless. One additional fact is, in the mention of domestic violence, is that 3,750 male sentenced prisoners were victims of domestic violence, compared to 1,323 female prisoners. Then there's been the rise of publicity surrounding female paedophiles. There have been a few high-profile cases recently where the sentence given to the women were much more lenient than those that would be given to men. Just the other week, we had the case of a babysitter who had sex with an 11-year-old boy and still escaped jail. There is no way on this planet that a male who had sex with an 11-year-old girl would have avoided prison, something that the NSPCC made in their remarks about the case. No chance at all. And yet that was the sentence handed down. These facts and figures show there are certainly questions to be answered in relation to the treatment of men compared to women in the justice system. it seems that there is clear discrimination against men. So if outcomes are all important, then what do people have to say about this? What's going to be done to deal with this balance? Well, the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Women, Equalities and Family Justice has made an announcement. She's just said that she wants to see fewer women in prison. Not fewer people, not fewer men. Yes, you heard me right, just fewer women. In fact, the Conservative, I will in a second, the Conservative manifesto said, we will improve the treatment of women offenders, exploring how new technology may enable more women to serve their sentence in the community. Now, I'm not someone who's going to be supporting prisoners, but where on earth is the equality in that? How does that fit in with the Equality Act? I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Does the honourable member consider that more women in the prison population is therefore desirable in the objective of achieving equality?
Yeah, yes, I think I'd like to see more people in prison. Well, that's a debate for another day. But I would certainly like to see women who commit serious offences sent to prison in the way that men who commit serious offences are sent to prison. Absolutely, I would. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for allowing me to make that point very clear. Where is the equality in the current sentencing regime? It's just like the example I gave of female prisoners not having to wear a uniform. Somehow the fact that hardly any women are in prison in the first place seems to be a problem just because it is. Well, it is just because they're women. If there is to be true equality in this country, then this cannot be allowed to continue. We should be gender blind when it comes to sentencing, if that's what the equality gender agenda is all about. If women commit serious crimes that are enough to warrant prison sentences, then they should serve them in prison. And we need to stop pussyfooting around when it comes to female offenders. Just like a judge in my local Crown Court, when he recently said to a female offender, I have every sympathy for your children, but the biggest burden they labour under is that their mother is a drunken thug. I couldn't have put it better myself before rightly sending her to prison. So, Mr Gapes, there are so many other areas where men are being discriminated against, or where they are suffering more than women. I can't go through them all now, unfortunately, and if they're not raised by other members today, I hope we will have similar debates in the future so that I will be able to highlight the further problems faced by men. Some issues I didn't have time to include are things like male circumcision and the effects this has on some men, the fact that men suffer from anorexia and bulimia too, the health effects of men not seeking help earlier enough to prevent their conditions from getting worse, the fact that men tend to live shorter lives than women, or the fact that boys underachieve in schools. But to conclude my remarks for now, I would like to say that I see this debate as a fantastic opportunity to deal with the issues that affect men. This Parliament should not be hijacked by those who want to constantly engage in perpetuating myths about men and women that are simply not accurate. Some people cannot see common sense for the blur of their rose-tinted, politically correct glasses. But I hope the message goes out around the country that we politicians are not all blind, and I hope that many of the men who contacted me today to say that they've never felt that anybody has reflected the problems that they faced, I hope they feel reassured that they do have a voice in Parliament, but on all issues that affect them just as much as everybody else. For a parliamentary democracy to work, everybody in the country has got to feel that somebody is speaking up for them. Today, lots of people feel at last their voices are being heard.
The question is that this House has considered the matter of male suicide and International Men's Day. Madeleine Moon.
Mr Gapes, I'm here to speak today as a member and indeed the chair of the All-Party Prevention of Suicide and Self-Harm, an area that I spent a considerable amount of time looking at and examining and hopefully raising the profile of within Parliament. Mr Gapes, language does matter, and being accurate about suicide and its legal status is incredibly important. Because what happens is if we continue to use the word commit, is we continue to isolate those families who have been bereaved by suicide. We continue to make those who take their own lives appear in a different class of those who died. We continue actually to criminalise their actions rather than to examine what can we do, what responsibilities can we take to prevent further suicide. I've talked to and worked with many families who have been bereaved by suicide, many individuals who've been bereaved by suicide, and all of them describe the same response: the isolation that they feel. Usually if a family suffers a bereavement, friends and neighbours are around there offering emotional support and practical support. If someone in your family takes their own life, often you're isolated. People don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. And also, often the family are under police investigation. Because when there is such a death, the first step of the police is to look at whether, in fact, this is a murder. And many families have described to me the absolute shock of being investigated as though they were responsible for the death and may, in fact, have murdered someone. People don't tend to cross police tape lines where the death has taken place, so they don't come and see the family. Often the police then leave because they've satisfied themselves that it is suicide, and they don't come back and explain to the family, you're no longer under investigation, and by the way, this is where you might actually get some help and support. And that's one of the most important things that families need. In those first few hours, they need to know, what do I do? How do I deal with this? How do I respond to something that has left them shocked, questioning why? Why didn't I notice? What could I have done? What did I miss? How could I? What could I have done to stop this? I most certainly will.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way and for the very important remarks that she has been making. She's now 3 minutes into her speech. She has not mentioned International Men's Day, and I wonder if she would be going to now mention male suicide and International Men's Day.
As I explained at the beginning of my speech, I'm speaking on behalf of the all-party group Suicide Prevention and Self-Harm. I will continue to do so. Mr. Gapes, one of the things that we have to do is look at how we support families. Families of men who die by suicide, and I concede that men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women. How do we support families? How do we support communities? There's excellent work, and I recommend it for those who wish to understand how we support those families, the work of Sharon MacDonald at Manchester University. But we also have to look at what we are doing in terms of our suicide prevention planning in the UK. The all-party group looked at the government's suicide prevention plan prior to its implementation, and then again following the reorganisation of health within the UK. And the result was quite shocking, because the new prevention plan, which was very good in many respects and set out good guidelines, did not require local authorities and health authorities to actually report back to the Department of Health. So we had no overall picture of what was happening across the country. So what we did as an all-party group was go out and survey to find out what was going on. We found that 30% of local authorities do no suicide audit work at all. So they didn't know what was happening. They didn't know how many men or women were taking their own lives locally. 30% of local authorities didn't have a suicide prevention action plan, so they were doing nothing to prevent suicide of men or women across their local authority area. More worryingly, 40% of local authorities didn't have a multi-agency suicide prevention group. One of the things that is very important is that we recognise that suicide is not the responsibility of one department. It's not the responsibility simply of the Department of Health. In fact, the most active department in dealing with suicide is often the police, because the police are involved when people make unsuccessful early attempts. it is more likely that the police will know of someone who's about to take their life or who has been at risk in the past than any other agency. Most suicides have never been anywhere near our mental health services. But what is important is that we do know what is going on locally. We need to make sure that the local authorities' multi-agency suicide prevention groups are made up of all agencies, whether it is the local authority, the health agencies, the police, the third sector organisations who often are doing the critical work on the ground. And I cannot say enough about the fantastic support that we get, every one of us, every day in our constituencies, from Samaritans, who spend their time tirelessly working with people who are very fragile and highly at risk of suicide. And groups like CALM, who the Honourable Member opposite said has given them so much help in relation to today's debate. Those agencies are made up of volunteers, many of whom have been impacted by suicide and wish to move services forward so that further deaths can be averted. But also coroners. It is absolutely vital that coroners are engaged and engage with all other of the partners to make sure that future deaths are prevented, but also to make sure that we are aware where clusters may be beginning to develop, whether it's clusters of an age group, clusters of an occupational group, clusters within a school or a factory. I want to just very briefly mention the big risk of social contagion. And it's again why words matter. I've seen headlines that say things like, well, it's just what we do around here. And if you give permission for suicide to be an acceptable way of dealing with the problems in life and your difficulties of dealing with it, then there is a risk of social contagion and other people thinking, well, that person was like me. If they can take their own life, I can too. And that's a huge risk. And it's an area that we need to work at dealing with. It is a great risk when it's in enclosed institutions, such as prison. It's a great risk when it's in closed institutions like schools and factories. So we need to be aware of the importance of emotional education and of language when people are faced with suicide. The emotional education of men in this country, and it's perhaps, and I dread to say it, the one area where I've agreed with the honourable gentleman opposite, that the emotional education that we give to young men in this country is very poor. No matter how modern a society we become and how diverse a society we become, we still seem to educate our children in a feeling that they have to man up and they have to be strong, that they can't talk about emotions. And that's where some organisations, particularly sports organisations, have done fantastic work in relation to suicide prevention. The one thing I want to also stress is the importance of longitudinal research into suicide and self-harm prevention. I have to say that in the past I was very, very fortunate in having excellent ministers, in the previous health ministers for Sutton and Cheam and North Norfolk, who were both very supportive of suicide prevention work. But the longitudinal studies of suicide and self-harm need to know that the researchers who are dedicated in this area will have the money to continue and to pursue so that we have a very clear idea of the deaths that are taking place and whether they are increasing or not. Mr. Gapes, I know other people want to speak, so I will end there. I will just say one final thing. The All-Party Group, in association with the All-Party Group for Mental Health, will be having a meeting in February where I hope the Minister will attend, where a psychiatrist from my constituency is coming up to talk about mental health triaging, so that people who are at risk of mental health crisis can go to any agency. So they could go to their social worker, they could go to their general practitioner, and that GP would be able to go to the triaging system and get help advice and support so that no one leaves being told there's an appointment in 6 months' time. We need to be on top of this. People are dying unnecessarily, and I thank you, Mr Gapes, for your chairmanship.
Maria Miller.
Thank you, Mr Gapes, and I would like to yet again congratulate my honourable friend on securing this important debate today. Mr Gapes, my honourable friend never fails to challenge the status quo. He never fails to speak without fear or favour, and I commend him for that. But International Men's Day is also about promoting gender equality. That's one of the objectives that's set out. And for me, Mr Gapes, striving for equality isn't a competition between men and women. Women face discrimination on a daily basis. That's not a myth. And my honourable friend does not do his case much good at all in an attempt to try and belittle that. In this place, Mr Gapes, there's currently more men sitting as male MPs than women who have ever been elected as members of Parliament. That is a fact, and I think it's a shocking fact. It's a great privilege to follow the Honourable Lady for Bridgend, who has done more than, I think, anybody to press for change on the issue of suicide, which, as we know, affects more men than women. And I would like to also at this point thank the Samaritans and also CALM for the excellent briefings that they sent to us all on those issues. Mr Gapes, perhaps if over the last 100 years we'd had more women, like the Honourable Member for Bridgend and maybe others, in this place, more of the issues that my honourable friend, the Member for Shipley, more of those issues that he's concerned about would have had better debate and would have been more fully addressed. And I would like him to perhaps consider that, because these are the issues that often are picked up by women members of Parliament. Mr Gapes, International Men's Day, as I said, isn't about pitching men against women. It's about men and boys' health, it's about promoting gender equality, it's about positive male role models, and it's about men's contribution to family life and to children's life. I have the privilege of living in a 3-generation family, and women are in the minority, but we have fantastic support from our male members of the family to achieve the most that we can as women as well. Mr Gapes, gender stereotypes are good for no one, and International Men's Day should use this as an opportunity to address that issue. Suicides are absolutely tragic, a tragic waste of life, and it is important that we have strong policies in place to address that. And in looking at the debate today, Mr Gapes, I was looking at what was the driving force behind those suicides. The Honourable Member for Bridgend has touched upon some of the issues that I know she has dealt with. And I was particularly interested in the issues around the expectations of being a man, the expectations that we put upon male members of our families and of our communities. I was also concerned about the impact of relationship breakdown and loneliness, and that impact that can be very strongly felt by men, particularly as they get older. And I'd like to perhaps focus my comments today on that and how we might start to tackle some of the problems that the Honourable Member for Shipley touches on in the problems that men have in trying to play a full role in all aspects of the community, in all aspects of life. Because, Mr Gapes, too many fathers, I feel, just when they suffer family breakdown, can lose contact with their children after an adult relationship breaks down. Too many fathers still find it difficult to play a full role in their children's lives, even if their adult relationship is still intact. I mean, clearly, when it comes to issues like domestic violence or situations where a child's welfare is, there are concerns about a child's welfare, it's right that a parent's role in their children's life might be curtailed. But I think there is clear evidence that in day-to-day life, we could be doing far more to support fathers' roles, particularly in their children's lives, and challenge what has become, I think, a continuing gender stereotyping in this area, that it is in some way unacceptable for men to take up a more active role in their children's lives, despite what I have to say are considerable improvements that this government, and before it the coalition government, made in putting in place support for all of us to have a more balanced approach to life, particularly when it comes to issues like parental leave and flexible working. But Mr. Gapes, when you look at the facts on those particular policy areas, men are still finding it difficult to access those policies. Parental leave is, I think, a particular case in point. In the UK, attitudes, I think, are felt to frown on the idea of men taking up parental leave. And indeed, 41% of men said that this was one of the biggest barriers to them actually taking up what was a legitimate and legal entitlement in this area. I'd be interested in the Minister's comments on this, because it's not just a problem faced by the UK, the Czech Republic, where parental leave legislation is the same for men and women. We still see men taking up a fraction of their entitlement when it comes to parental leave. So this isn't just something that is a problem for the UK, it's something that is European-wide. And indeed, the Scandinavian countries, which are so often, Mr. Gapes, held up as a paragon of virtue when it comes to issues to do with family policy, in Finland, less than 9%. There's less than 9% of uptake of parental leave by fathers. So I think this is probably something which is a European-wide phenomena, indeed perhaps a global phenomena as well. How can we make sure that men have access to parental leave, which can give them important role in their children's lives in those very early days? And there is undeniable evidence from countries like Germany that encourage parental leave, that having a very active role in your child's life under the age of 5 can help encourage, support and nurture a stronger lifelong relationship between a father and their child. I think, Mr. Gapes, this is something that's important. It's something that we need to understand. We have the policy in place. How do we make it work for men? When it comes to flexible working, I applaud the government for the work that it's done in ensuring that flexible working is now, the opportunity to request it is now open to everybody. Yet dads are twice as likely to have requests for flexible working rejected by employers. Just under a fifth of fathers applying for flexible working are turned down. However, men are also less likely to apply for flexible working in the first place, with just 17% of fathers requesting flexible working compared with 28% of mothers. You know, yes, Mr. Gapes, women still face all sorts of impediments in their progress in the workplace, but men face barriers too. Perhaps it's inflexibility within government structures, or maybe it's expectations as well, that men should be the main breadwinner. We have to address these issues, not only to ensure that men can play a full role in their sons' and daughters' lives, but also that women can make the progress that they need to. In conclusion, Mr. Gapes, I would say that the Equality Act defines protected characteristics as one of the main protected characteristics as gender, and it's regardless of sex. And indeed, I would point out to my honourable friend that the very first report that's been done by my committee is on transgender, which is an issue that affects us men and women, and the inadequacies of the policies and processes that are in place in that area. So we need to make sure that gender is never used as a basis for discrimination. International Men's Day does not dilute the real issues that women face, the real discrimination and the real gender-based violence that they face. This International Men's Day is an opportunity to challenge all gender stereotypes, which are not good for any of us, and to support men to speak out, as women speak out very often, not only on behalf of women, but on behalf of men too.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Gapes. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I wasn't going to speak in today's debate, but felt very moved to over events that have occurred in York over the last few days. But before I do, may I just say it's a pleasure to follow the member for Basington and Basingstoke and some of the issues that she raised, but especially a pleasure to follow my right honourable friend, the member for Bridgend, and I know she's got real expertise in this area. And I thank the member for Shipley for securing today's debate, because I think it's an important debate, although I have to say I don't concur with many of the comments that he made, and I like to think that we debate based on evidence, and anecdotal comments often don't add to the debate.
Hear, hear.
But it is a really important debate, so I thank him for that. And it's important that we recognise the needs of men also, and many of the challenges that men face in our communities. Just this last week, I had the pleasure to meet with a group of men and Age UK, which we were highlighting the issues of isolation in men in later life and looking at establishing a men's shed in York, where a safe place where men can gather to discuss issues. Particularly this project throughout the country has been successful, where men have had that space to talk about some of the challenges they face, and particularly health challenges that they face, of which obviously mental health being part of that. But I really came to speak in this debate because in York there's been a big debate about today and whether or not we should recognise International Men's Day or not. In fact, the university was going ahead with a programme today, and it's unfortunately reached national headlines that it's withdrawn from engaging with the process today. And I say that is with regret. It's on the back of a petition from 200 students to say that they didn't think the day should be recognised today. But this is a university who is committed to equality and progressing that agenda, but has also lost the life of 2 male students just before I took up office. And I think as a result of that, I think it's really important that the university does bring challenge into many of the situations and services available, and to be able to speak on these issues. One of the things I think which is really important is, and which wasn't perhaps reflected earlier on in the debate, is that we do recognise separately the importance of raising the issues around women. And I think we don't say that they're mutually exclusive. I just think they're important that we also recognise the importance of that and the ongoing importance of that, because there is huge inequality across our society. But I do recognise there are some areas where there is inequality for men, and that's why it's important to take this forward. And I think particularly if we look at the levels of suicide across our country, far too high. One person taking their life is far too high. And the fact that in 2013, 6,233 people felt that they couldn't carry on living means that we have got so much work to do, a 4% rise on the previous year. And if I look at my own city of York, shockingly, as I was looking into this debate, York is the 4th highest place in England for male suicide, behind Darlington, County Durham and Calderdale, which again is really concerning. If you note, those places are based up in the northeast and Yorkshire of our country, so we've got a geographical issue as well to address. And behind that, we might want to have a look at some of the causes of suicide, because unless we face up to the challenges that other people are facing up to and use this place to address the causes of suicide, we will never address those shocking statistics. In York itself, we've seen such a rise in suicide. Now at its highest level, 22 people lost their life in 2013. And I know even since I've taken office, people have taken their life. And looking at those causes, we know that the last few years have been particularly challenging for so many. If we look at issues around personal debt, around austerity, unemployment, that can have a real impact on why people feel they can no longer go on. We know people are struggling with mental health challenge and people facing changes, whether it's a loss or reduction of benefits or other factors, which has meant serious life changes, but also serious financial challenges being placed on the family. I'm happy to give way.
I'm very interested in the suggestion that this is all sorts of things have relatively recently been examined. But could she explain why it is that men are not men will not lose, men are less likely to see their suicides going down, whereas women are noticing those things go down?
I thank the member for his comments there. I think this is why the research that my member for Bridgend referred to is so important. We need to understand so many of the causations of that. If we look particularly at Greece and the way that the recession has impacted on Greece, we know that male suicide rates have increased tenfold in Greece, and it's a really serious issue. So there is some serious research that's been done out there, but I do think more has to be done, and about the shape of our economy and the impact that that has on personal life, and therefore the challenges people face as a result of that. On top of those very difficult statistics that, of course, we all across this chamber wrestle with, one of the things that I think I really want to just highlight in the time I've got left is about the services that are there to support people with mental health challenges. We know that they are overwhelmed at this time with demand. I look at York Mind, a fantastic organisation under great leadership in York. York Mind has experienced, just over the last 3 years, a doubling in demand of its services. 650 people 3 years ago, 1,300 this year. And therefore we're seeing demand going up on our not-for-profit organisations which I know are always challenged about where their next pennies are coming from, where their resources are coming from. And I think if we're going to take a strategic approach, we need to ensure that the infrastructure bodies are well resourced in order to deal and address the issues. But of course, it's always important to get upstream and address the causes. But we've also been faced with another challenge in York, and that's the closure of Bootham Park Hospital. It's our mental health hospital in York, closed because of the suicide risk that the old building built in the 18th century presented, and those issues not being addressed. And therefore, in order to reduce the risk on individuals, a new risk was created in the way that the hospital was closed, increasing risk that people are now scattered over 50 miles away in order to get the services they need. And some of those people having to move to a place of safety as far away as Harrogate, having a crisis in the back of an ambulance is not appropriate at all. And therefore, it's really important that we see facilities in the right place so people can access them at their time of need. One of the consequences of Bootham Park Hospital closing has been, though, an investment in the street triage team, and that's why I very much concur with the remarks my honourable friend from Bridgend has said, because the street triage team is there on the scene addressing issues at the earliest possible point of intervention. But the risk has increased because there are no facilities then for somebody to go to, and the real concern that is bringing the insecurity that brings individuals, and lead clinicians who were working at the hospital have highlighted the risk factors of closure. And that's why my continual plea is that we look at the infrastructure and the interrelationship between the not-for-profit organisation, the health service and the other agencies when addressing issues of suicide, because we've got a responsibility, an obligation, I would say, to make sure that those bodies are working seamlessly together, because it's our responsibility too if somebody is pushed to that limit of taking their life if we haven't got those things right. I thank you, Mr Gates, for your time.
Thank you, Mr Gates. I want to start this afternoon by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Shipley, on securing this historic debate. The first time ever that the International Men's Day has been marked by a debate in this Parliament. And I want to also start by thanking my right honourable friend, the member for Basingstoke, and the honourable ladies opposite from Bridgend and York for bringing their own individual perspectives to this debate. This debate gives us an opportunity to consider a number of subjects under the heading of the range of International Men's Day, which particularly affect men. But there is, in my opinion, none more worrying than that of male suicide. And I want to restrict my remarks, Mr Gates, to that particular issue. It is a subject which, I have to say, is all too often swept under the carpet. And it's been said that at the outset of this debate that one of the problems that we face today is underachievement by white working class boys from the north of England. Well, as a white working class lad from the north of England, I'm very proud to take part in this debate. And indeed, as a member of the Backbench Business Committee, I was pleased to play a very small part in being able to grant this debate this afternoon. I listened with interest to the comments that were made about why the debate is being held here in Westminster Hall rather than on the floor of the chamber. But as right honourable members will be aware from the order paper, this afternoon 2 debates have been scheduled on the floor of the House, one on the forthcoming conference in Paris on climate change and the other on the new cancer strategy. Those debates, it was felt, needed to take place on the floor of the House. I would have liked to have seen this debate personally be on the floor of the House, but we are where we are, and it is better. I should also say that it was felt that we should try and hold this debate, if at all possible, on International Men's Day itself, which is what we've achieved today. But as I said, Mr. Gapes, I want to try and restrict my remarks to the subject of male suicide. It is a subject which no one really wants to talk about, and I approach the subject. Yes, sorry, I'll give way to the right honourable lady.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Just as an illustrator of how important actually having this debate is, can I tell the honourable members present that the first piece of evidence the all-party group took from professionals was from a suicide prevention worker in London who was also a mental health worker, and he said, if I call a meeting to discuss mental health problems, I can fill a room. If I call a meeting to discuss suicide, I'm there on my own. And that says everything. So everyone who is here taking part in this debate, I thank them for actually generating that conversation that's so vital.
Well, Mr. Gapes, I'm very grateful for that intervention, because I think it does highlight, that vignette highlights a lot of the problem, really. I think the mere fact that we're holding this debate and able to discuss it, maybe not at the main chamber, but here in Westminster Hall, where hopefully it will generate some debate, some wider debate from outside Parliament, it might make it just that little bit easier for the debate to take place in the wider society. As I was saying, I approach the debate with some trepidation because, as has just been so amply demonstrated by the Honourable Lady opposite, who's chairman of the all-party parliamentary group on suicide and the prevention of self-harm, there do seem to be very many bodies, both governmental bodies in the public sector, charities in the independent sector, and academics looking at this problem. They've all got greater experience than I have, and I've looked at it with fresh eyes. And part of the reason why I'm here this afternoon is because I was just staggered by the intransigence of the problem. There are clearly very many people looking at this problem, but the reality is, and this is not a party political point, these numbers have stayed pretty stubborn when we look at the number of male suicides over decades. It doesn't matter whether you've had a Conservative government under Mrs Thatcher or a Labour government under Mr Blair. These numbers for male suicides have stayed pretty much the same. And it's that made me think, well, there's something serious going on here that is wider than just the typical argument about party politics. I do want to pay tribute as well to the charity CALM, the campaign against living miserably, because they provided some helpful briefing and some helpful figures for this afternoon. And they state that in 2014, more than 3/4, so 76%, 3 out of every 4 suicides were men. 4,623 deaths. Suicide, and it is worth repeating, Mr. Gapes, that suicide is the biggest single killer of young men under the age of 45. And in my own region, where my own constituency is situated, for deaths registered in 2013, which is the last year that the Office of National Statistics figures go up to, in the northwest, they had a male suicide rate of 21.2, the second highest in the country, second only to the northeast. It appears, and those who are experts in this will of course be aware of this, that these rates are invariably quoted in the statistics as a rate per 100,000 of the population. So it's 21 out of every 100,000. And as always with these statistics, there are a whole host of caveats and technical details that could be explored. But I don't think we should let the minutiae obscure the big picture here. And that the big picture is that whilst the rate in the northwest amongst men was 21.2, the second highest in England, the rate amongst females was 6.3. So 21 against 6. There is a very big difference there indeed. Yes, I'll certainly give way.
Thank you. I do thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I thank him for talking so sensitively about this issue. Male suicide is an issue that I too am greatly concerned about, and that's why I came to this debate. And I just wondered if he's spoken very knowledgeably about the rates of male suicides, but is he also aware that young gay men are 6 times more likely to take their own lives than their straight male counterparts?
Well, that is indeed a statistic which I've heard twice today, because that was heard in the main chamber earlier. I was there when the shadow leader of the House made that. I don't know whether that statistic is right or wrong, to be perfectly honest, and I'm prepared to accept what the lady and the shadow leader said about it. And I am sure that amongst those 4,000, more than 4,000 deaths, some of them will be gay men, some of them will be young gay men. And that may well be one of the contributing factors. The charity Calm have set out 4 areas where they think action should be taken. Firstly, and quite understandably, they state that there is a need for timely and accurate information. I have to say that I think that this could be applied to very many things across government. It always amazes me how long it takes for what ought to be, on the face of it, fairly simple statistics to be collated for them to reach the public domain. Secondly, they say, again, very understandably, we need to understand the reasons why people take their own lives, because there is a strong element of contagion, and this was something which the Honourable Lady opposite to von Bridgen mentioned. And thirdly, they want to see all local authorities develop and implement a suicide prevention plan, and state that those who do not should be named. Fourthly, they state that if national and local suicide prevention plans are to be effective, there must be some accountability. It's no point having a plan unless something is done about it if they're not adhered to. I think it's also worth noting this afternoon that they have, in their own way, tried to give this issue some publicity through their use of social media and their #BiggerIssues campaign, their advertising campaign, which tries to draw attention to the fact that as a society, we often pay an inordinate amount of attention to perhaps relatively trivial topics such as what the weather is and what sort of coffee we're drinking and those sorts of things, rather than something which is a real problem in society, that of male suicide. And they have established a digital posters featuring the hashtag bigger issues, which were posted across the UK, and they were changed every 2 hours to reflect the fact that every 2 hours a man takes his own life. And this campaign was run in association with the men's grooming brand Lynx, and I think we should pay tribute to whoever it was who has taken that decision. It's a brave decision, I think, to link a grooming product for men with this campaign, because it's something that perhaps others have looked at and thought, oh, it's a bit too touchy for us, we'll leave that one alone. And so I think we should, whoever it is in that organisation, publicly thank them for being able to associate their brand and put their name to that particular campaign. Now, this phenomenon, I was particularly surprised to find out, is not unique to this country. Right across the world, in almost every country, there is the same stark difference in the suicide rates. Lithuania, Russia, Japan, Hungary, Finland, wherever you look almost, it's the same picture. The number of male suicides considerably outnumber female suicides. Apparently it's not the case in China. Now, I'm not an academic, I've not spent time looking into this, but I would think that it seems to me that there is something there for the basis of the solution to be found, that we do have one country in China where it's the other way around. And so there must be something there that will perhaps give a solution to this problem, which will come out in years to come. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, there are those, and you know, we're a parliament with different political parties, and for our own reasons we will try and make party political points. And when I've raised this already, people have immediately come back and say, well, of course, it's all the government's fault. Or the fact that there are lots of men committing suicide, it's all your government's fault because you're making cuts to public services, you're cutting the NHS, which is not true. There's more money being spent on the NHS than ever before, so unfortunately that argument immediately falls. And of course, these arguments are very easy to make. It's simple to throw out and say, well, it's all the Conservatives' fault. But I'm going to demonstrate that the statistics, the facts from the Office of National Statistics simply do not bear this out. In the 1980s, under the Conservatives, the number of male suicides each year was somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000. Now, it did vary, it varied a little bit. Sometimes it got down as low as 4,066 in 1982, and then it went up to 4,370 in 1987. It did vary, but every year it was between 4,000 and 5,000. Under the last Labour government, between 1997 and 2010, the number of male suicides each year was somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000. And again it varied. Some years it was down, some years it was up, but every year it was somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000. But what is noticeable is that the gap between male and female suicides has been increasing steadily virtually every single year since 1981. So if we look back at the start of this range of statistics, it was about double. A bit less than that, 1.78, I think, but it was about double. Yes, I'll certainly give way, and I'll come back to this point because I'm not quite finished it.
This gets terribly technical. It's the issue around, if I can explain, how suicide is recorded. And they are recorded under an international definition that often the statistics require researchers to go into coroner's records and read individual, what are called narrative verdicts. So The records are slightly skewed. They are indicative rather than totally accurate, because there is a difference between a clear suicide verdict that says it's a suicide and a narrative verdict that would need to actually mention intent. So we have a problem in terms of accuracy, in terms of our recording. I'm sorry, Mr. Gapes, I thought it was just important to clarify that.
Yes, well, I'm grateful for that, and I think I mentioned that there are a whole host of caveats and technical details. So I spent some time looking at these statistics and working out how they'd been arrived at, and there are, as the Honourable Lady quite rightly says, a number of difficult issues for researchers to look into, and that could sort of skew the figures. But what I would say is that whatever the difficulties that there might be, they would apply equally to males and females.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So they wouldn't affect the overall point that I'm making here. And that point is that back in the beginning of the 1980s, the difference was about double. And today, it's about treble. So it's gone from a ratio of about 2-to-1 to about 3-to-1 today. And I don't think that this change can simply be put down to government policy, whether it was happening under a Conservative government, and it continued to happen for 13 years under the last Labour government. As Public Health England, who produce a whole raft of figures on this subject, have said, suicide is often the end point of a complex history of risk factors and distressing events. And the Samaritans, who, again, along with other honourable and right honourable members this afternoon, I must pay tribute to, because they are perhaps the best known charity in this field for the work that they're doing, trying to help and prevent men and women who are feeling depressed from taking their own lives. The Samaritans, in their review from 2012, found that men from working class backgrounds were particularly at high risk of suicide. And the Samaritans stated that suicidal behaviour results from a complex interaction of numerous factors such as bereavement, divorce, unemployment, and the historical culture of masculinity. It is a huge and complex subject, and I know that there will be many people involved this afternoon that we would be grateful to at least highlight some of the issues involved. I hope that what comes out of this debate this afternoon is that those people who are feeling depressed, and often it is because of many reasons, not just one reason, that they feel that they can tell someone of their own worries. And I think that one thing we can all agree on, from whichever political viewpoint we approach this subject, is that suicide and taking one's own life is never the right answer. I hope this debate today will help break down the stigma that prevents many men from seeking the help they need. Thank you, Mr. Rossington.
Liz McGuinness. Oh, you haven't put in to speak? Oh, my goodness. You're on the list, I'm afraid. Okay. Amanda Soloway.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rossendale. May I thank my honourable friend, the member of Shipley, for securing this important debate, especially as it's on International Men's Day. I think we should have a proper discussion about these issues and the consequence of how it affects so many people in the UK today. I think it's only right that we talk about the issues of male suicide rates and domestic abuse among boys and men, as they are key and have a massive effect on our society, and we just can't afford to ignore them. But I would like to focus particularly on male suicide. I've spoken many times about my personal experience of male suicide. The loss of my cousin, who tragically took his life at 36, has had a profound effect on our family, giving us first-hand experience of the heartbreak that this event can bring. The signs were there. He was trying to get help, but it just didn't happen quickly enough. Sadly, this case is not unique. Today, 30 men in the UK will take their own lives each day. The male suicide rate across the world is at a 14-year high, and the use of antidepressants has increased 5 times since 1991. Mr Rossendale, having spoken to my right honourable friend about these issues several times, I know how committed he is to the cause. And I know that we've made inroads towards helping people get the support they need. But I'm sure members on all sides of the House will agree that we need to do more about this. Ending the stigma related to mental health issues has to be a priority for every gender. But society tells men that it's okay not to show their emotions, and that we really need to change this, enabling the male population to talk at all ages to talk about their issues and to show that this is a strength and not a weakness. From the age of about 9 or 10, boys are told to man up, be strong, and keep their feelings to themselves. They're told they can bottle things up, and they do this because they're scared of the banter. That's why suicide is the biggest killer of men under 50. It's why 40% of the men aged between 18 to 45 have thought about suicide. Organisations like the Samaritans do great work to help people suffering from depression, but men need to feel they can contact them in the first place by first admitting that they have a problem. Of course, warning signs can be seen and should be seen way before the thought of suicide arises. But by the time a young men are considering suicide, the damage has often already been done. We need to tackle the issue of schools, in colleges, at work and at home, and in sports clubs and pubs up and down the country. So we need to speak directly to schools. We need to speak directly to children and parents. We need to be honest and say that it's okay for boys of any age to talk about their feelings. And we need to do it now. This is why this debate is so important today. When society tells men not to talk about issues, we should lead the way and tell them it's all right to talk about these issues. So, when we're at the pub tonight, don't just ask your mate how he's doing, really ask him how he's doing. When your son comes home from school and you ask him and he says he's fine, consider what that really means. And if someone you know is acting out of character, it could be that these are the early warning signs for depression. Seriously, they might not tell you, but it'll matter that you've asked. Tiny steps will make a difference. We know that we need to talk about this issue more. That's why I welcome the debate today. The more we can talk about this and make sure that mental health receives the same importance as physical health, the better. All of these issues, like male suicide rate and male domestic abuse, are so important. I wanted to keep this small, just to make the point really about suicide, male suicide. But we all have a responsibility to keep them high on the agenda, and we must work together to look out for our male population. Thank you.
Dr. Paul Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr Rosendahl, for the opportunity to consider today the important issue of suicide, particularly male suicide, and to represent the Scottish National Party in this debate. I congratulate the Honourable Member for winning this important debate, but I must admit that I found many of his remarks unrelated to the title of the debate. I'm certain, Mr Chairman, that the lives of all of us in the room today, men and women, will have been touched by suicide in our families, among our circle of friends, or perhaps in our wider social network. That's certainly the case for me. The reasons that people are driven to take their life are, of course, both complex and intensely personal. However, depression, alcohol and drug misuse, unemployment, family and relationship problems, including divorce, social isolation, wealth inequality, social disadvantage, and low self-esteem are identified as key triggers for male suicide. Sadly, those with severe mental illness remain at the highest risk of suicide, and among them, those who refuse or those who decline medical treatment are at a higher risk still, and particularly vulnerable. In addition to health issues, social and economic factors influence people to take their life. I've alluded to wealth inequality already, but we know that men in midlife from low-income backgrounds are consistently identified as the highest risk group. In England, Northern Ireland and Scotland, the male suicide rate is approximately 3.5 times higher than the comparative female rate. In Wales, the male suicide rate is approximately 4.5 times higher than the female rate. In September 2012, the UK government published a report entitled Suicide Prevention Strategy for England. That report identified factors influencing increases in suicide rates in England. The report was clear in noting that periods of unemployment and severe economic problems do adversely affect the mental health of the population and can be associated with higher rates of suicide. The report was followed up in 2014. In that year, last year, the study again found an association between the areas of England worst affected by unemployment and increased prevalence of suicide. Indeed, between 2008 and 2010, there were approximately 800 more suicides among men and 155 more among women than might have been expected based on analysis of historical trends. Like me, my colleagues in the Scottish Government are deeply concerned with suicide rates also and have put in place a suicide prevention strategy that clearly sets out the actions the Scottish Government is taking to prevent and further reduce suicide in Scotland. The statistics on Scotland on suicide, which currently indicate a downward trend, even in male suicide rates, show that the Scottish Government's strategy is achieving outcomes that run counter to the general trend for the UK. The Scottish Government's strategy has 5 key themes. The first is responding to people in distress. Second, talking about suicide. Improving NHS Scotland's response to suicide. Further developing the evidence base. And lastly, supporting a broad programme of change and improvement. In developing these themes, the Scottish Government has acknowledged that there is a broader focus of activities that can effectively contribute to reducing overall rates of suicide. Activities within this broader focus of activity include building personal resilience and promoting mental and emotional well-being in both schools and in the general population, working to reduce inequality, discrimination and stigma, promoting high-quality early years services and working to eradicate poverty. All of this work is undertaken in a context of enhanced vigilance in respect of improving mental health, supporting people who experience mental illness and, of course, preventing suicide. The Scottish Government's original suicide prevention target was to reduce the suicide rate in Scotland by 20% by 2013. Since 2002, when that target was originally set as part of the Choose Life Strategy and Action Plan, we have seen an 18% reduction in the suicide rate. In the years 2009 to 2012, Scotland has seen the lowest number of suicides since the early 1990s. That is a reduction in the number of suicides at a time when many other jurisdictions were mapping increases. Nevertheless, there are some comparable trends with the UK. Taking probable suicide figures for 2011 and 2012 together, almost 3/4 of those who died in Scotland were male. This gender imbalance has been broadly consistent for much of the last 10 years. However, the major element of the 18% reduction in the suicide rate since 2000 has been a reduction in male suicides. The Scottish Government's suicide prevention strategy now establishes a revised target to reduce the suicide rate in Scotland by a further 10% by 2020. This target mirrors the global target established by the World Health Organization. The Scottish Government's strategy focuses on suicide prevention activities in communities and in public services to enable people to live longer, healthier lives, which is a national outcome. The strategy makes manifest a determined commitment of the government of my country to continue the downward trend in the rate of suicide and to make progress towards meeting the WHO target. Mr Rosendale, International Men's Day focuses on life issues, including suicide rate, violence against men and boys, educating and parenting. International Men's Day has stated, when 13 men a day in the UK are dying from suicide, it is essential that everyone in positions of power, trust and influence do everything that they can to help men talk about the issues that affect them. International Men's Day supports the campaign for improved outcomes led by the Campaign Against Living Miserably, which also seeks to raise awareness of male suicide. The campaign aims to encourage people to talk about male suicide in the hope that this will decrease the number of male deaths attributable to suicide across the UK. To the campaign's great credit, the organisation's helpline currently receives over 5,000 calls per month from individuals seeking advice and support. 80% of calls to this helpline are from men. The Campaign Against Living Miserably has stated, it is our belief that all of us at one time or another, regardless of gender, will hit a crisis and we could all do with specialist help when things go wrong. These are wise words. The Campaign Against Living Miserably has also released a parliamentary briefing that highlights an adverse impact of the UK Government's work capability assessments on suicide rates and notes that each suicide costs an estimated £1.7 million, in addition, of course, to the much more significant and obvious catastrophic emotional and social impact of a life being lost. I noted recently that the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health found that suicide was associated with the UK Government's Work Capability Assessment Programme. Indeed, the research found that each additional 10,000 people subjected to work-capable assessments was associated with an additional 6 suicides, 2,700 cases of reported mental health problems, and an additional 7,020 prescriptions for antidepressants. In sum, that adds up to an additional 590 suicides, 279,000 cases of mental health problems, and 725,000 additional prescriptions of antidepressants based on current claim levels. These figures are for England alone. The researchers noted, our study provides evidence that the policy in England of reassessing the eligibility of benefit recipients using the work capability assessment may have unintended consequences for population mental health. 590 suicides at £1.7 million sums to over £1 billion. We must, of course, add to that figure the cost of treating and supporting almost 300,000 people struggling with mental health problems, and count the cost of providing almost 750,000 prescriptions for antidepressants. Again, these figures are for England alone. Significant as the financial costs are, they fade into insignificance when compared with the human cost of lives lost, opportunity wasted, and families destroyed by suicide. It seems clear, therefore, that in addition to health, economic and social status, UK Government policy is directly contributing to the prevalence of suicide today and imposing enormous financial pressures on public services already struggling to cope with significant budget cuts. Work capability assessments and the work programme are having a significant negative effect on mental health. Reports repeatedly highlight the heart sink felt by people when they receive a request from authorities to apply for jobs they are unlikely to win and hear nothing back, and of the stressful targets enforced by job centres contributing to a lack of self-worth. Work capability assessments exacerbate feelings of failure and are increasingly being cited as significant factors in individuals' decisions to attempt suicide. When individuals are already vulnerable and already likely to be suffering with low self-esteem and experiencing chronic stress in respect of providing for their families, work capability assessments contribute nothing positive. It's clear that more men take their own life than women. Nevertheless, the effects of austerity and its mental health impacts are felt just as strongly by women and indeed by those left behind in society. I suggest that the Minister take up the challenges of tackling the socio-economic inequalities in society and recognise that social exclusion is a very significant risk indicator of suicide. I would like the UK Government to pay attention to the needs of boys, teenagers and young men to prevent vulnerability in later years and perhaps more straightforwardly scrap the work capability assessment that is proving to be far too costly in terms of both human life and finance wasted. Suicide, Mr Rosendale, must not be thought of as an issue that is solely affecting men just because the number of deaths is higher among men. Any campaign targeting suicide must be focused on the entire population.
Lucy Allen.
Thank you, Mr Rossendale. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I'd like to pay tribute to the honourable gentleman opposite for his very thoughtful comments. I would suggest that he too strayed somewhat off topic when talking about work capability assessment, because today we are talking about International Men's Day as well as men's suicide. I'd particularly like to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Basingstoke, because I think that the Honourable Lady has, Right Honourable Lady, has adopted a very measured and helpful tone to this whole debate. It is clearly a sensitive issue, and I think that it is only helpful in the same way as the Honourable Lady for York in addressing this issue in a very calm and measured way. I do thank the Honourable Member for Shipley for bringing forward this debate, and the Honourable Member has worked hard to do this. And it is a day today, International Men's Day, that we should celebrate role models of men, male role models, and their contribution to society and family. And it's also an opportunity for all of us to work towards improving gender relations. Now, I don't agree with many things the Honourable Gentleman in fact said, and particularly I don't agree with what he describes as an obsession with increasing the number of women in Parliament. In fact, I consider that to be a very noble cause and something that I am absolutely passionate about. Nor do I agree with him that equality is more women being put in prison. So we may have to differ on that one. I have to declare an interest. Yes, of course. I'd be glad to.
David Nuttall.
I'm sure my honourable friend's quite capable of speaking for himself, but I think what he actually said was that he wanted to be sure that more women who were convicted of committing serious offences were in prison.
I'm sure the Honourable Gentleman is correct, and I apologise if I have misunderstood his remarks. I declare an interest because, like many of us here, I have many men in my life. I have a partner, a father, a son, brothers, and it is the supportive men in all our lives that enable us to do what we do and to be the best that we can be at what we do. I wanted to take part in this debate because I believe as a constituency MP, I should speak for all the people that I represent. Yeah. We have 191 women in Parliament representing men and representing women. Yeah. And it's right that we talk about issues that affect those whom we represent. Too often, we polarise the gender debate to a place where we depict men as aggressors and women as victims. Many women who, like me, have a real passion about gender equality. Many women, like me, who identify as a feminist, feel deeply uncomfortable about the increasing negative caricature of men and the negative gender stereotyping of men. My son said to me, "I don't like feminists, Mum." And I said, "Oh, why is that?" "Well, they don't like men, do they?" Now, it's wrong to blame today's men for a patriarchal society of yesterday. It doesn't, in my view, enhance equality for women to antagonise and create hostility towards men. And we should all bring up our boys and our girls to believe in equality for all. But certainly, with regard to our boys, we should not bring them up to be ashamed of their sex. For me, equality isn't about forcing men into wearing a white ribbon, and the Honourable Gentleman has now left the room, and I think it's a wonderful campaign. They don't need to be shamed about the violence of other men towards women and demonstrate their shame with a badge. And it's not about forcing elder statesmen of this House, a man from a different era, to say the word tampon in the chamber. Equality is always about having the same chances in life. Yeah. And that is what today should be about. I spent last Friday evening on patrol in Telford with the police, and we were talking about violence against men. We had just attended a domestic violence incident, and I asked about the incidents of domestic violence against men. And I was told that they are very, very rarely reported, and the figures the police are fully aware skew the reality, particularly those under 30, because there's many, many reasons why men under 30 would never admit to their girlfriend having smacked them or given them a shove or something else. We don't talk about it. Today is also an opportunity to focus on all the issues that adversely affect the life chances of men and boys, and adversely impact on their ability to be the best that they can be. The cause of extraordinarily high rates of male suicide is simply because men do feel unable to vocalise their emotions. They bury it. So should we really then say, as a society, or indeed a parliament, that it's not appropriate to discuss these issues? I say not. Mr. Rossendale, in my constituency, a particular area of concern is the underachievement of boys at school. By any measure of attainment, boys from disadvantaged socioeconomic groups perform less well in school. Only 28% of white boys on free school meals in Telford achieved 5 A to C's GCSEs, whereas girls from a similar background were doing significantly better. More boys experience behavioural difficulties at school than girls, more exclusions from school, more admissions to pupil referral units. I used to be involved in a pupil referral unit. There were very few girls within the unit. And then the boys start to self-identify with this bad boy image, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And all that goes with that, and the anger and the frustration and the self-harming, and then your life chances are kind of set in stone. And we see more young men engaging with the criminal justice system, more young men in the prison population, in gangs, involved in knife crime, and then we go on to wonder why these same young men have violent relationships with the women in their lives. I think it is deeply simplistic to characterise men as either violent or chauvinistic. Most men are neither. Now, I didn't want to come into Parliament only to talk about women's issues, and I definitely didn't want to come here to find that I can't talk about issues that are of fundamental importance to my constituents in Telford. We talk a lot about hedgehogs, and we talk about UK sea bass stocks, and we talk about trees and various other topics of real interest to people's constituencies. But I want to talk about issues that are important in Telford. In Telford, male suicide is higher than the average for the West Midlands and higher than the national average. What does the Telford Council talk about? Well, it too has embarked on an elaborate social media campaign parading photographs of men on Facebook, holding up signs saying, "I support the White Ribbon campaign." And these poor men can hardly refuse for fear of being labelled anti-women. And I really wanted to know, what were they doing about men and boys in Telford? And I think the fact that nobody wants to talk about it is the crux of the issue. I'm on the Education Select Committee, and we do talk about STEM subjects for girls. And that doesn't mean much in Telford, particularly if you're a boy from Brookside who's struggling with maths and English and getting into trouble at school and getting angry and frustrated and getting excluded and then getting in trouble with the police. So men feel they've got to talk about women's issues and wear white ribbons, and women feel they don't want to be disloyal to the sisterhood. So today, I thought twice about coming along. I didn't want people taking to Twitter and attacking me for wanting to talk about men's issues. And then I remembered why I came to Parliament. I came to Parliament to talk about issues that matter to people in my constituency. So I'm glad I'm here, and I'm glad that everyone else that's come along today is also here, and for the very valuable contributions that everyone has made. I do feel that I owe it to the failing boys in Telford and to the young men they turn into to be here today to put their case. Now, the men in my life talk a lot. They talk about sport, and they talk about work, and sometimes they do talk about politics, and they definitely know how to get their voices heard. but they don't always say what they're feeling or what's worrying them. And usually they feel a need to always be strong, to be brave, to be the breadwinner, to be the man with the chiseled jaw in the Gillette advert, if anybody remembers that one. Men are uncomfortable expressing their feelings and talking to somebody about how they're distressed or desolate they may feel. And this is because society has embedded a social acceptance that men are expected to be strong at all times, and failure to do so is considered a weakness or indeed a failure as a man. We only have to look at society today to see the pressures placed on men's shoulders when it comes to the workplace and being able to provide for their families. Not feeling able to talk about these issues only makes it worse. And I would echo the comments that have been made by many honourable members. The impact of suicide on children and the families left behind is indescribable. The guilt, the sense of abandonment and rejection, a loss that as a child you can never quite fathom. You don't recover from suicide as a family member left behind. I want to finish on a positive note. Today is about men's health. It's about improving gender relations, about promoting gender equality and highlighting positive male role models. So I'm delighted that this debate has been held. We definitely need a more collaborative gender politics, and I'm not sure if the Honourable Member for Shipley quite achieved that. I'm sure that was his intention. Let's make sure that these are issues it's all okay to talk about. Let's remember that women have men in their lives, men that they care about deeply. Seeking help is hard, and it's harder still for men as an admission of weakness, and it's even harder still if society generally will not talk about it. I'm very grateful to the Backbench Business Committee for allowing this debate to be brought forward, and in fact, I am extremely grateful to the Honourable Member for Shipley for being brave enough to do so, and I particularly thank him for urging men to seek help and to know that they are not alone. And if this debate has achieved that, then the Honourable Member for Shipley is to be congratulated. Thank you, Mr. President.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Rossendale. And I am grateful for the opportunity to take part in this debate as the Shadow Cabinet Minister for Mental Health on International Men's Day. And I will be responding specifically to address the motion which looks and tackles the issue of male suicide. I'd like to thank honourable members from all sides of the House for their contributions throughout the course of this debate, which reveal just how significant a challenge male suicide is in all of our communities. I would also like to echo my thanks to CALM, the Campaign Against Living Misery, for the work that they have done to raise the profile of this issue and to push for a debate on this matter. Their Bigger Issues thunderclap today has reached millions of people on Twitter and across social media, and I think it's an important indication of the strength of feeling there is about this issue. I should let you know, Mr. Rossendale, that only this week on Monday it was the Mind Media Awards, and there were countless nominations for programmes and coverage that had raised this very significant issue. And in fact, the winner of the campaign award this week was for the Find Mike campaign, which was run by Johnny Benjamin and Neil Laybourne, and really recognised the contribution that they have made to this debate as well. I would also like to pay tribute to my honourable friend for Bridgend as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Suicide and Self-Harm Prevention for the vital contribution that she has made and the group has made and continues to make in the ongoing debate on suicide and how we as a society can and should be doing everything that we possibly can to prevent it. I'd also like to thank the Samaritans and the Royal College of Psychiatrists for their very helpful briefings in advance of this debate. Mr. Rossendale, the rate of male suicides in this country is a national scandal. And I think it's shocking that in today's society, the number of people taking their lives is increasing. The fact that such a disproportionate amount, a number of those suicides are by men, does demand our urgent attention. And I'll share again some of the statistics that we've already heard, but they are so significant. The total number of suicides in 2013 in the UK, 78% were male, 22% were female, and suicide is the single biggest killer of men aged under 45 in our country. Every person lost to suicide is a tragedy for their loved ones, for their friends, for their community, and for society as a whole. And honourable members from all sides have raised cases of suicide in their own constituencies and with their own families, and each one is tragic and devastating in their own right. The impact of suicide, we know, can be wide-reaching and incredibly long-lasting. And apart from the obvious human cost, often affecting whole school communities, whole college communities, whole workplace communities, we must also consider the huge economic cost. And I was particularly struck by the Department of Health's impact assessment, which puts the economic cost of just one suicide at a staggering £1.7 million. Today's debate has given us an important opportunity to examine the factors that might lie behind these shocking statistics. A report by the charity Mind outlines just some of the possible reasons why men are more likely to take their own lives. The report suggests that men compare themselves to a gold standard of masculinity, of power and control, and they are more likely to feel shame and guilt when they fall from this standard. We know that there's a link between unemployment and suicide. Unemployed people are between 2 and 3 times more likely to take their own lives. And just this week, we've seen some research that's come from the University of Liverpool, which looks at those areas which have had a higher amount of work capability assessments and the number of suicides that have also taken that have happened tragically in those areas. Yeah, that's sure.
Very grateful. Her and the SNP spokesman keep trying to draw attention and blaming suicides on the work capability assessments. Can we just will she accept the facts that it was the Labour government who introduced work capability assessments? In those assessments, over 60% of people were found fit for work in those assessments. In work capability assessments today, only 27% of people are found fit to work. So it was her government were finding more people fit for work under work capability assessments than this government ever did. Will she at least acknowledge that fact rather than trying to make a rather cheap political point in a speech?
Well, in response to the intervention from the honourable member, I pointed out just one reference to the work capability assessment, and it's particularly relevant because it's research that's been very particularly relevant and prominent in the press today. There are many other factors, it's just one of them, and I'm going to go on to address all of those different points, but it's research that's been conducted academically, and we do have to reference it particularly this week. It's not a political point, it's something that's particularly significant in many of our communities and has been raised by members on all sides of this House, not just on this side of the House. There are also some groups of young men who are particularly at risk, and research from the charity Metro found that over a third of LGBT young people have attempted suicide at least once. Shockingly, in recent years, again, this came to light in recent weeks, suicides in our prisons has increased by more than 50%, and every 4 days a prisoner will take their own life, and the majority of those will be men in our prisons. Analysis by the Samaritans and a number of academic studies show that there is also a very strong link between socio-economic class and suicide, with those living in deprived areas on the lowest incomes most at risk. Men are more likely to take risks with drugs and alcohol. Men are also much less likely to open up to their friends and family and seek emotional support, and this is a point that's been raised during this afternoon's debate. We've also heard, and I echo the concerns about the impact of economic crises on suicide rates. My honourable friend for York referred to debt, and we heard about the challenges, particularly in Greece, where they've also seen an increase in suicide. All of these individual factors are important and demand our consideration and attention, and I hope the Minister will respond to each of them in turn. Mr Rossendale, whatever the factors at play that may contribute to a person wanting to take their own life, there is one argument that we must never lose sight of, and that is that suicide is not inevitable. If people are in crisis, good care can make the vital difference, and it can and does save lives. We've heard that there are some challenges with people with mental health problems getting the right support that they need. There's particular challenges around fragmentation in the system. Service users, professionals and experts are warning of a mental health system under pressure. The number of people becoming so ill with mental illness that they need hospital care, that figure has increased. And at the same time, the number of mental health nurses has decreased, and we're hearing too many instances of people having to travel hundreds of miles for a bed, or in some cases not getting any help at all. The Royal College of Psychiatrists has advised that men tend to use more lethal forms of suicide than women. And this means it is absolutely vital that the very first time that someone raises that they have had suicidal thoughts, that they get the very best support possible. It is absolutely vital that that support is provided in the first 24 hours after a crisis begins. Now, there are many mental health charities that have long been campaigning for better crisis care. Research from the charity Mind found that people in mental health crisis might not be able to get that help immediately. And I would also echo the comments made by my honourable friend for Bridgend and for York Central about the role of the police. And there are some really important pilots going on across the country with street triage teams. I've had the opportunity to join one in Liverpool, and I've seen firsthand the really fantastic work that's going on between the police and mental health professionals to particularly contend with issues around suicide and suicide prevention. They often identify those people and take them to that safe place. But we know that only 1/3 of people who used NHS crisis care services were assessed within 4 hours. And I think that would be of particular concern for all of us on all sides of the House. Their research found that when people do present to services, maybe they've been brought by a member of the police or a street triage team, there might not be enough staff to provide the right care that they need. And when someone does have a mental health crisis and they are most at risk of suicide, one of the places they are most likely to be taken to is that local hospital A&E department. And I echo the point that was made earlier by the Honourable Member for Faversham and Mid-Kent, that there is a very serious shortage of liaison psychiatrists working in acute hospitals. Again, I've had the opportunity to join a number of these teams in A&E. They do an incredible job under very, very difficult circumstances, a lot of pressure, but I've heard firsthand that they say they're not able to deal with all the cases that they'd like to in an adequate time. And again, this is something that should concern us all. Having those experts on hand is key to making sure that people get the support they need. So I'd welcome an update from the Minister on what work he is doing to increase the number and coverage of liaison psychiatrists in our hospitals. We on this side of the House welcome the Mental Health Crisis Care Concordat, this national agreement between local agencies to work closer together when responding to people in mental health crisis. And I note that there has been great strides made in supporting the police to improve their response to people with mental health problems. However, it isn't clear what tangible progress is being made on the ground, specifically in relation to suicide, as a consequence of the Crisis Care Concordat. And a report out only last week from the King's Fund found that just 14% of people felt that they had received appropriate care in a crisis. And I hope that the Minister might share with us what plans he has to evaluate the work of the Crisis Care Concordat and in terms of what it's achieving and what it might go on to achieve further down the line. My honourable friend for Bridgend rightly raised the issue of suicide contagion. This is a complex and under-researched area, and I echo the concerns made by members of all sides of the House made during this debate about the challenges about the lack of research when it comes to suicide. There are some great research facilities, but they are far and few between, and while they lead the way in the work that they do, the funding for all types of mental health research is significantly lower compared to research into physical health conditions. I note that Public Health England published guidance in September on how to identify and respond to suicide clusters, and I hope the Minister might share what work his department is doing to understand more about and prevent suicide contagion. Ensuring people in mental health crisis get the support they need is an urgent priority. However, if we are ready to stem the tide in male suicide, we must do much more to prevent them and prevent men from reaching crisis point in the first place. A number of honourable members have raised the very important point that 3/4 of all people who take their own life are not in contact with mental health services. Men who are suffering from depression are much less likely than women to look for formal help from mental health professionals. They are also less likely than women to even talk to their family and friends about how they are feeling. We need a cultural shift so that men feel able to discuss their mental health, to seek help and get the support that they need. And just as important as ensuring that men feel able to talk openly about their mental health is ensuring that when they do come forward, there are services available that they feel comfortable accessing. We need to do more to ensure that men can access information on mental health problems and the support that is available in what might be traditionally considered male settings, a point that's also been made this afternoon, where men meet, where they eat, where they spectate sport. I've seen firsthand the work that Everton in the Community do, an organisation that's connected to Everton Football Club, particularly looking at mental health. They have mental health champions. They do work more often than not on the football playing field or just after, and they make a really significant impact. That's a great project, and there are other such great projects, but it's not the norm, and it's more work that we need to be doing. There is a real need for joined-up working between different sectors, including the health, social care, education, employment, social welfare and justice departments, to reach out to men who might be depressed and at risk of suicide. And underpinning all of this is a need for a concerted and coordinated approach from government to prevent suicide. The government's suicide prevention strategy was published in 2012. And yet, since then, as has been reflected, we still have the numbers of suicide that we're seeing in our country. Mr Rossendale, I think it's fair to say that this strategy hasn't been as successful as any of us would have liked. And my honourable friend for Bridgend raised concerns that this strategy lacks teeth, with no timeframes or tangible reporting mechanisms by which to measure its success by. And I wonder if the Minister agrees that it is time for an urgent review of this suicide prevention strategy. We also do need timely access to data about suicide. It's not right that there is a 2-year delay to receive these figures. And I ask the Minister what plans he has to improve the availability and transparency of information relating to what is actually happening across the country in relation to suicide. Mr Rossendale, in light of rising rates of suicide, it is clear that we need a revolution in the way that suicide is prevented. A revolution that must address the factors that so many more men than women take their own lives. For too long, mental illness has been the source of stigma and prejudice. That means that often people, but men in particular, feel that they can't talk openly about their mental health problems. We've seen a few brave public figures such as Stephen Fry, Graham Norton, and my parliamentary colleague Kevin Jones having spoken up about their own mental illness. But for too many, mental health remains hard to speak about openly. And only last week I was in my constituency surgery where a man in his 50s told me that he wasn't able to relate to either his siblings or his parents about the mental health condition he'd been affected by throughout his adult life. I think it's incumbent on all of us to make the rhetoric about parity of esteem a reality. And challenging stigma is key to making that equality for mental health a reality. We need a cultural shift so that men can discuss their mental health, and that cultural shift needs to come in our schools, it needs to come in our colleges, our universities, our workplaces, so that men should feel able to seek help. And we need to overcome the stereotypes of masculinity placed upon their shoulders in order that men get the support that they need. Each suicide is a terrible tragedy and a waste of precious life. And today we've had so many contributions from members on all sides of the House about the important work that must be done to tackle this challenge. There are many practical steps, and it's clear from these contributions that together we can prevent suicide and save the lives of many, many men. And I look forward to the Minister's response.
Alistair Burke. Thank you, Mr Rossendale, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. It's nice to get a reasonable amount of time. 4:30? It's nice to get a reasonable amount of time without being shouted at it for spending a little bit of time on my feet. So I'm pleased to be in that position today. And the honourable gentleman. Can I begin, if I may, by congratulating my honourable friend on raising the debate and picking the topic for debate. To say thank you to Calm and to the number of other charities that have backed the debate, and to thank all the colleagues who have spoken I'll come to almost I think everyone's speech in due course, but to thank, there's a couple of colleagues who've been in here all the time and have not spoken. My honourable friend, the member for Worcester, my honourable friend, the member for South East Cambridgeshire. And it's sometimes unusual to find colleagues who sit and listen because they're interested in a debate rather than feeling the need always to contribute. And I do appreciate them, we all appreciate them being there as well. Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments? I will come to those. I'm only mildly annoyed that some of the things I wanted to say she's already said, but I will come to that in due course. I can say it again, and she's either read my mind or had a look at my speech in advance, but we'll come to that in a second. But can I start? I want to spend the bulk of my remarks dealing with the suicide part of this, but I want to start with International Men's Day, if I may, because I recognise the significance of that, and that's why we're here. And firstly, to comment on my honourable friend's speech. I have referred before to my honourable friend as the honourable gentleman, the member for Grit and Oyster, and once again he proved it to us today. This place is used to rough speeches, and it's used to the fact that if you want to get anything done and say anything mildly controversial and challenge people, there is the chance that you'll not only challenge, but you might put some people's noses out of joint in doing so. And my honourable friend is particularly good at both of those. And we all have to take the rough with the smooth. We've all sat in the House of Commons and we've heard things on all sides that we may not like. But it's all part of it. That's what this place is about. And you don't get things done by going along with the status quo all the time. And once again, I heard things that I appreciated from the honourable gentleman and things that I thought were profoundly wrong. I want to start by saying that I echo the feelings of those who spoke in the debate, who said the purpose of International Men's Day is to highlight the fact that gender equality is not a zero-sum game. It's not one thing to be gained at the advantage of another. And certainly in the Department of Health, our approach to those illnesses and conditions that might specifically affect men or women is that both deserve equal attention, and neither one is done at the expense of the other. And I think that's really important. There is a strand of this argument on both sides that occasionally expresses themselves in challenging ways. The Honourable Lady, the member for York, made brave reference to her own intervention in relation to the row at York University, to say, actually, it is right and important to think about something like International Men's Day, and a university censoring it and preventing something happens, frankly, looks rather silly. And there's a lot of stuff in the United States at the moment about the prevention of free speech that is getting into that area. And academic institutions need to be particularly careful at making sure they're not shutting down debate just because they don't like it. The Honourable Lady was quite right. But here, I think we've had a debate which has emphasised that it's not a zero-sum game. There are particular issues where men are specifically challenged. And it's important that they're raised as issues in their own right, not as some sort of situation where their position is particularly because they have been disadvantaged by women. The underachievement of boys, the underachievement particularly of white male boys, working class background, that's a real issue that any of us would be concerned about. It doesn't need to be considered as whether or not women are doing better. It's just a fact for those boys. What can we do about it? And the honourable gentleman was right. The difficulties in family issues and separation and matters such as that, these are particularly hard because the courts, of course, have as their primary objective the paramount importance of the interest of the child. It is not the interest of one party or the other. It's the paramount duty of the court is to have the interest of the child as the basis of what they do, and how that is interpreted can be very tough in contested situations, and that pain is felt by men who suffer separation is very real. And it's not meant to suggest that pain is not suffered by women in similar circumstances, but the facts are as they are, and not to raise them and not to feel that it's important would be missing something. And my honourable friend was quite right in relation to that. So in terms of the In terms of the issues which he raised and the challenges which he gave us, as I say, I think some of those challenges, to put things on the record, were right, and some of the challenges I wouldn't necessarily follow. But I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for, as he always does, being prepared to confront things that some others might shy away from. And that actually is what this place is all about. The Honourable Lady, I'll go through these in order because just the way I did my notes. The Honourable Lady, the member for Bridgend, made a quite excellent speech. Again, giving a demonstration to people outside this place that there are colleagues here who get so immersed in a subject that they really know their business and they're able to speak authoritatively on it from years of experience and practice. And the Honourable Lady gave us an object lesson in that. She was right in relation to language. And when she raised the issue, that the way to refer to this issue is not now to say to commit suicide, but to say to take one's own life. It wasn't designed to chastise my honourable friend or anything else. I had a similar conversation about this week with Johnny Benjamin, and I'm pleased to say Johnny Benjamin is here and following this debate very closely, because I had also used the phrase, because it's a common phrase. And it's right to challenge it because, exactly as the Honourable Lady said, it does suggest an attitude of mind in which it is similar to committing a crime. That was not the intention that I had when I used the phrase, and I felt and I understood entirely when Johnny suggested the right way to approach it is taking one's own life. Because what the Honourable Lady said about the feelings of the family are very considerable. And to add to those feelings of loss, the sense that their loved one has done something that might be criminally wrong, it wouldn't have struck me in the first place, but on reflection, I certainly understood it. So that remark was not meant to chastise anyone, and I have corrected my own way of looking at this in result of what I was told. And I think that's just sensible sensitivity. The Honourable Lady also mentioned the importance of coroners. I can tell the House, in case they didn't know, because I didn't know until I took on the job, coroners write to me if they feel that there is something in the case that has a wider government impact reflecting on my department. So I started to get coroners' letters. And it's a very, very important part of the process that when coroners feel that they've uncovered something in one particular case that has a wider application and government can do something about it, that they say so. And I really appreciate it. I appreciate the work of those coroners, and could I just take the opportunity to pay tribute to them, thank them for the thorough work that they do in investigating the deaths that they do, and it's much appreciated by government. My right honourable friend, the member for Basingstoke, spoke about, again, attitudes and the importance of handling this in the way which is not a zero-sum game, which I quite appreciate, and also recognise that an honourable friend had challenged gender stereotypes in what he said quite rightly. She spoke of parental leave. I think the Department of Education deals with that, and I think we'll get an answer to her on that. It is an issue, and it's strange, but I suppose not surprising, that it's handled similarly around Europe and around the world, that men don't take the opportunities that are given to them. I suspect that's an attitude that may change over time, but I will ensure the Department writes her and gives her an answer. She also made reference to her living in a multi-generational house. I also live in a multi-generational house, but there's only 2 males in mine. All the rest are women. There's me and Mr. Darcy, my darling daughter's pug. We are the only 2 blokes in our house, and I depend on him for male company when I get home. But multi-generational houses can be a lot of fun, and I appreciate living in one very much. The Honourable Lady, the member for York, I've mentioned her challenging York University. She made reference to the issues at Bootham Park, on which we are both well-versed, and I appreciate the work she's done on this, as has my honourable friend, the member for York Outer. It is a particular situation which has arisen because of the closure of that hospital, because of the risks that she mentioned. It does exemplify the fact then that work has to be done as swiftly as possible in order to replace the facilities that have been lost. And she's entirely right to say the Trust has got to have a good eye on where people are being treated now and how we can get back to local facilities as soon as possible. She knows she has an open door to come and see me when the moment is right. We are pressing the authorities locally to bring forward their plans as to what they're doing, and we will certainly do that. My honourable friend, the member for Bury North, may God continue to bless it and all its wonderful people, again spoke of the the need to challenge stereotypes, but he made, I thought, a remark that I do want to come back to because it's absolutely central to this. And the Honourable Lady, the member for Liverpool Riverside, spoke about this as Liverpool Wavertree, forgive me. Liverpool Wavertree said this, and this is what has been so wrong. It's acceptance. My old friend gave every impression of being outraged that we have sort of accepted that there is a figure for suicide in this country and a gap between men and women that we have sort of got used to. And he's right. And that's going to be at the very heart of my remarks in terms of dealing with this. He's looked hard at the statistics to examine the gap between men and women and found not only is it consistently there, but it's also widening. And I think he's right. And that will form part of my comments when I'm looking at the suicide issue in particular. But I thank him for his work in relation to this. My honourable friend, the member for Derby North, whose constituency I visited a few months ago to meet a group that she had brought together dealing with a variety of mental health issues. And she'd take my kind regards back to all of them because I found that a very instructive meeting with them. Again, spoke of her difficult personal experience in relation to this. And it also made reference, as a number of colleagues did, to this issue of men in particular because of their feelings about their place in society, their feeling of inadequacy should they admit any sense of failure, their worry about not fitting in, the issues of banter and everything else. That brought to mind, of course, the tragedy of not too long ago, the loss of Gary Speed, the Welsh international manager, and the impact that had on the sporting community, that someone seemingly in full command of his life and everything else could have such things going on that would have led him to do what he did. And I think, along with other celebrities speaking about it, colleagues talking about it in the House, it's that sort of occasion that wakes people up and says, this is clearly a bigger problem than we realised, and it's probably one of the reasons we're all here today. And in doing so, my honourable friend, as did the Honourable Lady, the member for Liverpool Wavertree, make reference to what good can come through sporting clubs, associations and things like that. I'm lucky enough in my constituency to be a member of a number of things. I'm president of Biggleswade Athletic Club. I go and see the football clubs in Biggleswade regularly. They're places where people go and they gather and have an association. And bearing in mind the difficulties that we've been talking about men in particular feeling loneliness and isolation, the more they can be scooped up and remain part of groups and organisations, they can be a really vital link. Maybe women do this differently and better than men. And maybe sports clubs and other sorts of places can do something even more. I commend the work being done at Everton in relation to that. And my honourable friends comment that when you're speaking to someone and you ask them how they are and they say fine, are they really fine? Most of us leave it at that because we don't want to get involved in the conversation. It's important to take that opportunity. Can I raise one other? And it's a bit personal, but not too harrowing, fortunately, in the circumstances. But it's also, I think, quite important. Last year, my old school magazine reached me, and in the obituaries column was the name of one of my classmates at school and someone I'd been to university with. And I was completely horrified. We'd been in touch reasonably regularly over the years, but not maybe for about a year or so. And I thought, my friend has died, and I don't know anything about it. In actual fact, it turned out to be, fortunately, a mistake. It was an error. But my immediate reaction was to hit the last number I had for my friend and to try and find out what had happened. And I found out it was wrong. And it shocked me. And I remember saying to him, do you know what this teaches me? We've got a number of friends we haven't been in touch with for a while. We don't always know where they are. And we're going to end up seeing each other's families at each other's funerals. So if we haven't been in touch with friends for a bit, and we've reached my sort of advanced age, and I've got a lot of school friends I remember very well. I haven't spoken to them for a while. We could just miss something. And again, I think blokes do this worse than women. If it wasn't for my wife keeping up with friends, and if it wasn't for her using Facebook and things like that, my social life would be much worse. So again, that's something, again, men can think about. And if we haven't been in touch with our friends for a bit, let's just do it this weekend. The Honourable Gentleman, the member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross, made reference to Scotland's suicide strategy. I'm very pleased to hear of this. In fact, the strategy goes back quite a long time, to 2002, a long-term strategy to combat the brutal fact that the suicide rate in Scotland is higher than that in the rest of the United Kingdom. If there are any lessons to learn with its falling rate, that's really important. And it's right that we should focus on what might actually work. My honourable friend, the member for Telford, again spoke about the underachievement of boys at school, looked at the particular issues in her constituency. She spoke about Twitter. Please don't be worried about being attacked on Twitter. You've got nothing to worry about yet. But I'll turn to social media when I make some further remarks, if I may. But again, the importance, my honourable friend, of my honourable friend's remarks was to talk about the issue. And although the honourable lady member for Haywood and Middleton didn't make a speech as such, again, she intervened with particularly pertinent comments, as she always does on these occasions. And it's good to see her in her place, and again, taking a strong interest in the debate right the way through. Before I respond, before I say any more, I've got a little bit to say, given the time and the opportunity, and I hope it'll be pertinent. I want to put some of my own thoughts on the subject on the record, and this is where the Honourable Lady has anticipated some of my views. I want to see the ambition of our society and the government changed in relation to the issue of suicide. Fundamentally, I want the government's position to be that we challenge the inevitability of suicide. Whilst I know that as far as our statistics are concerned, we are mid-range for societies such as us, that's not good enough. Do we need to know more? How do our strategies compare with others? Have we identified the right drivers? And are our local and national strategies flexible and dynamic enough to respond? And why, in a world where gender equality is encouraged as the norm, do we have to speak specifically about men, because this does affect men more than women? Since I've been in office, I've been much moved by those I've met in relation to suicide. I've met those who help in prevention and counselling, those who work clinically, those who campaign. But most of all, I've met those who've been touched by the tragedy of suicide in some way. I'm fortunate. I've not personally been affected through the loss of a close friend or a member of my family, but I have known others more tangentially. I've met those whose children have taken their own lives, others who've come close to it themselves. The other day, I met Johnny Benjamin, as I said, whose story of having been persuaded against suicide by a stranger on the bridge led to his extraordinary efforts years later to find successfully the man who saved him. He's taking a close interest in the debate today and spends much of his time taking his story and the issues surrounding it to help others. And as an example of those people around the country are doing that, I'm sure we commend that work and deeply appreciate what he's doing. The shock and emptiness left by suicide is excruciating to behold, hard to listen to, and desperate to feel. So I think we have a new challenge. What must we do to be the best, to have the best suicide prevention strategy in the world? Because being mid-range is no longer good enough for any of us. So with this in mind, I'd like to assure you that mental health is a key priority for this government and set our work in that context, which the Honourable Lady raised. And we want to do all we can to build on the current momentum and ensure people get access to the services they need when they need them. We have done a certain amount to fulfil this commitment, and the Honourable Lady was generous to praise one or two of the things that have been done. Johnny Benjamin and others have done a great deal of work in terms of making people more aware, and his #FindMike campaign has captured many hearts and minds. We've legislated for the first time parity of esteem between mental and physical health via the Health and Social Care Act in 2012. We became the first government to put in access and waiting times in relation to mental health. Last year, we gave the NHS more money than ever before for mental health services, an increase to £11.7 billion last year, and have invested over £120 million in order to introduce for the first time the waiting time standards. I'm very conscious that when I say this, people say, well, not in our area. There is this issue about how this national money appears in local CCGs. We're on to this. There'll be better monitoring this year. We've made it very clear that CCGs must use an increase in the amount they get proportionally for an increase in mental health services. And we're watching it because it's a fair criticism and something to watch out for. To help extend the accessibility of very successful talking therapies, in which we are a world leader, We invested over £400 million in recent years in the IAPS, the Improving Access to Psychological Therapies programme, to ensure access to talking therapies for those who need them, and this has led to very real improvements in the lives of people with anxiety and depression. We've also invested over £33 million in crisis care. We launched the Crisis Care Concordat in 2014, and now every local area has in place a crisis care action plan to support people experiencing a mental health crisis and to receive the right help and support when they need it. I welcomed the CQC report on it some months ago. It was a bit tough in places, but I felt it was a report that we'd commissioned it, and it's a sort of baseline. Where can we do well, where can we do better? I recognise that A&E didn't come out of it particularly well, and we need to strengthen the relationships there. I noticed that police and ambulance services did well when they'd responded to people in crisis care, but best of all were the independent and voluntary agencies where they'd been involved with people. And I think there are lessons to learn from all this. Building on all this to street triage and everything, which I'll mention later, I think this has been one of the most interesting things to come out of it. It isn't found universally, and in local areas where I've been to, sometimes they want to have a different approach. But there's no doubt that the Crisis Care Concordat itself and what the government has sought to achieve from that has made a real difference. And it's certainly being monitored. The Honourable Lady is absolutely right. I take a very keen interest in this. We are monitoring it locally and nationally. And I expect to see the CQC reports improve as time goes on, because we want to look at where they've found concerns. One of the ways that we can look after people better with mental health issues is to recognise that those with mental health issues often have physical issues. Sometimes this has been poorly regarded in the past, and that can add to a feeling of depression and isolation and not being considered. That can play into the issues that we're talking about. So it's very important. We've committed NHS England through the NHS mandate to address premature mortality in people with mental illness. And one of the ways we can do this is to look at the person behind the illness and provide treatment and care for the whole person, so that we also address the physical health and social care needs of people with mental illness. It starts early. And let me say a brief word about children. I'm particularly keen to ensure that we get the right support in place for children and young people. We've committed to invest an additional £1.25 billion over the life of this Parliament to improve the mental health and well-being of children and young people. We know that for many, mental illness can manifest itself early in life, and the first experience of psychosis for many people is during adolescence. We're using this additional investment to improve awareness of mental health issues in our children and young people, and to improve the information and support our children receive at school on mental health well-being. There can't be enough warning about the dangers of peer pressure, social media, and the ways in which this can induce depression and harm for young people at a sensitive age. My honourable friend made reference to Twitter. If you look at what young people are facing on Facebook and other social media, this can be immensely damaging. And the new technology is a boon, but it has risks and dangers, and I think by talking about it, it's very important. Can I commend, if I may, to the House, the report issued just this week by British Youth Council, their Youth Select Committee of 2015, Young People's Mental Health. Mr. Rosendale has a particular recommendation in relation to this, which I might read. Cyberbullying and sites which promote self-harm can have a significant impact on the mental health of young people. Hoping that children will simply stop using social networks is not a solution. We recommend that the government should facilitate a roundtable for charities, technology companies, young people and the government to work together to find creative solutions needed to help young people to stay safe online. The government will be issuing a full response from both my department and the Department of Education to this, but could I commend the Youth Council and that Select Committee for their hard work that they have put into this, and say that their work will certainly be taken very seriously. About a month or so ago, I got a letter from a young lady, not in my constituency. She'd written to the Prime Minister, and she said this. I'm writing to you to express my ideas on new legislation. The topic I've chosen is extremely personal to me. I've lost a friend to suicide. And I feel as though if he had a better understanding of his own illness, he would not have felt the need to take his own life. Not only this, I also feel that if the people surrounding him at his time of suffering were better educated on the topic, it would have helped him to feel less alone and unaccepted in today's society. It was a brave letter and a good letter. I'm hoping to see the young lady at an event we're doing to combat stigma. But the point she made again was that this starts early. I'm very pleased that the government has now got a minister in the education department specifically devoted to mental health issues in schools. I appreciate the work. I can't remember Sam's constituency, but it'll go in the record, Sam Diamond's constituency. But Sam's the minister, and we're already working together on these issues. But I think that demonstrates the determination of government to work across government departments to meet these issues. Can I turn now, finally, and I do appreciate the indulgence of the House, to talk about suicide and men? Of course.
Which we haven't touched on much in this debate so far is the issue of homelessness. And men are more likely to be homeless, they're more likely to sleep rough. I think it's 87% of rough sleepers who are men. One constituent of mine, Hugo Sugg, talked about how sleeping rough drove him to thoughts of suicide. But how he actually wants to campaign for a better attitude towards youth homelessness and how we can encourage people to look at those people who are suffering from homelessness as a chance to turn their lives around, a chance to take them forward, and working with some of the fantastic charities that work in this space. Would my honourable friend just join me in paying tribute to the charities and the organisations that campaign against homelessness and the job that they can do in saving men from suicide?
Mr. Berg. My honourable friend is absolutely right. I think increasingly those connected with housing are recognising the relationship between housing, mental health issues, and indeed in relation to suicide. And one of those that I met when I was with my honourable friend in Derby North, I think, was the lady who was responsible for the YMCA there and their particular housing outreach that they had. And she made some very pertinent comments to me at that time. So it's absolutely right. Housing and homelessness are closely connected with this, and I do indeed commend my honourable friend's constituent. We know that men are often reluctant to talk about mental health problems, and a number of colleagues have referred to men's attitudes. I don't think I need to overlabour that. They're reluctant to talk about the problems and to seek help when they need it. In part, we know this because some men feel this may be a form of weakness. We do need to assure men that this is not the case, and so many colleagues have made that point from their respective positions today. We, along with the charities Mind and Rethink Mental Illness, are seeking to reduce the stigma around mental illness through the Time to Change campaign. Time to Change aims to empower people to challenge stigma and speak openly about their own mental health experiences, and particularly men, as well as changing the attitudes of the public towards those with mental health problems. This campaign has improved the attitudes of more than 2 million people. However, we know men can be a particular hard-to-reach group, and we are looking further at ways in which to improve reach into that area. We all know tragically what the outcome of unacknowledged mental ill health can be for a person. When someone bottles it up, and a phrase used in the chamber today, their condition can worsen and may in worst cases increase the rates of suicide. As I mentioned earlier, suicide rates in England remain low compared to other European countries and other UK administrations. But I am concerned, as we all are, to see that suicide rates have been rising in recent years. We had anticipated this after the global financial crisis in 2008, and it has been seen in other countries around the world. The Honourable Lady, the member for York, made reference to that. We know about this. And again, it's important that the inevitability of that should not go unchallenged. We can appreciate it comes with extra pressures, but what can we do about it when we know these times are coming? We know that the recent rises in suicide have been driven by an increase in male suicide, which was the very point of my honourable friend's raising of the debate in the first place. This means that the already threefold difference between male and female suicide rates has increased further, and we know this is a common experience for other countries around the world. It's right then that preventing suicide is dominated by efforts to prevent male suicide. But in doing so, we do recognise that it affects everyone, and men or women, boys or girls, where it's happened. It is an immense tragedy. In relation to men, the greater risk of suicide is a complex issue. Many of the clinical and social risk factors for suicide are more common in men. Cultural expectations that men will be decisive and strong can make them more vulnerable to psychological factors associated with suicide, such as impulsiveness and humiliation. It's critical in addressing these issues that we provide information and support in a way that suits men's needs and behaviours, and that we provide services that are appropriate for men, which may include moving away from traditional health settings. So what are we doing about it, and what are we going to do about it? We published the Cross-Government Suicide Prevention Strategy for England in 2012. I'm committed to implementing it by working across government and with our partner organisations in the NHS and other sectors such as transport and in the community, voluntary and charitable sectors. I will also be speaking soon to our partner organisations to discuss how we can review and strengthen the National Suicide Strategy. I want to make it clear that I see this as a dynamic and flexible instrument, not something that we've done and I'm going to see how it works through and make some decisions in years to come. We're looking at it now. It needs reviewed and refreshed now, and it's an ongoing process, and I'm very committed to it. The objectives of the strategy are to reduce suicide, support people bereaved or affected by suicide. It's right that men are identified as a high-risk group within the strategy, for which our suicide prevention activities should and are prioritised. The strategy also recognises that schools, social care and the youth justice system have an important contribution to make in suicide prevention by promoting mental well-being and identifying underlying issues such as bullying, poor self-image and lack of self-esteem. As well as the strategy, we continue to provide financial support for the National Suicide Prevention Alliance, which brings together our key partners across government and the community, voluntary and charitable sectors with expertise in suicide prevention. I'm particularly pleased to say that many of the organisations that have campaigned for this debate are members of the NSPA. I know that the National Suicide Prevention Alliance has been working collectively with all these organisations to develop its strategy for delivering improvements in suicide prevention, which I welcome, and I know that my Department of Health officials are helping with this work. These organisations make tremendous individual contributions to suicide prevention. I know that the campaign against living miserably, which was prominent in calling for this debate, worked tirelessly to specifically target men to support them to feel able to talk about mental health issues. The Department of Health provided financial support to CALM in its early days, and I'm proud to see how it's grown in size and profile. I've had a variety of meetings since I took office. I've mentioned some of them already. I went to see the Samaritans Bereavement Centre in Peckham to coincide with World Suicide Prevention Day and to mark the launch of a joint initiative between Crews Bereavement Care and the Samaritans. I've met with British Transport Police and saw the extraordinary work that they're doing with Network Rail. I've seen in Birmingham some of the triage work, the placing of a mental health professional in the police control room 24 hours a day to help provide the information that's necessary. I held a meeting on suicide prevention on the 29th of June with representatives of research, different areas like Merseyside, the east of England and the southwest, and the Samaritans. And we also started to look at something called zero suicide. I have an interest in the concept and the ambition of zero suicide. The man who's pioneered this in Detroit in the United States is a college acquaintance of mine many years ago, Ed Coffey, and I'm very interested to see his work. There's part of it that we can follow. There are things that are different in the States that won't quite be pertinent here. But I think the whole concept, Mr. Rosendale, of zero suicide, of recognising that as an ambition to challenge the inevitability of suicide is really, really important. And that grabbed my attention very much. Public Health England has also recently published the refreshed Help is at Hand document, which provides compassionate support and information to people bereaved in suicide. I want to conclude, and colleagues have been very generous, just by saying a little bit about research and data, because that covers a number of issues raised by colleague. One of the key drivers for improving our approach is investing in research and data. I want us to lead the world as well in suicide prevention research and to be at the forefront of service delivery and using best knowledge and information to provide the best care. We've invested over £1.5 million on suicide and self-harm prevention research since the National Suicide Prevention Strategy to inform and target our strategy for reducing suicide rates. I'll have a look and see if it's enough and see what more needs to be done. The Honourable Lady, the member for Bridgend, made a remark about longitudinal studies. We are committed to carrying on that work in relation to that. We've provided the multi-centre study on self-harm in England with £300,000 this year, and I will very much bear in mind the opportunities that we might have to do more. The zero suicide ambition that I mentioned is being piloted in 3 areas of England, in Merseyside, the South West and the East of England, and early learning from the pilots has identified some innovative practice, which I'm sure can help other areas to develop innovative plans for reducing suicide in their communities. So there'll be more research there that we can work through and find if there's applications elsewhere. Of course.
And whether that work will extend to our prisons where I think we've got a particular area of concern.
Yeah, two things. I know that the Department of Justice is looking very closely at the increase there's been in rises of prison and detention suicides. Again, it's not huge statistically, but any rise or increase is a matter of concern, and they are indeed looking carefully at it. And in relation to the work capability assessments, which has been mentioned, which did indeed start in 2008, and that was about the time that a rise in suicide began to happen. I think the recent study, the authors themselves said they were cautious about making a link between cause and effect, but I've already asked the Department of Health to have a look at it as well. I think it's important that my department has a look at that study, and we look at the matters that are involved there, so I've already asked colleagues to do that. This has been a really good debate, a really important debate. Firstly, to put the issues of International Men's Day on the agenda, to talk about male issues, to talk about them in a way which is not a zero-sum game, but to make reference to some difficult issues that aren't discussed enough, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for doing it. We've had the bulk of our time spent on suicide. It's an occasion where the House has been able to work together to demonstrate a common interest in things that affect us all. The sense I get from everyone is none of us are prepared to accept the status quo and simply see these statistics, as my honourable friend from Bury North said, just be accepted. These won't be easy things to tackle. The reason why more men commit suicide than women is not due to anybody's making them do so and anyone's fault, but it's a fact. So what more can we get into? What can we learn from overseas? And what can we learn from the work being done in different areas? I'm absolutely confident that this House will talk about it again. And hopefully when we do so, we'll have learnt still more. And with the benefit of those from outside the House who provide such excellent work to look for this, perhaps our ambition of making ourselves the country with the best suicide prevention strategy in the world can, in time, become a reality.
Philip Davis.
Thank you very much. Can I thank you, Mr Rosendale, for chairing this session, along with the Honourable Member for Ilford South. We very much appreciate that. I echo the Minister's remarks that we've had a very good debate. We've had the expertise from the Honourable Lady for Bridgend, who chairs the all-party suicide group and who represents a constituency that was more tragically affected by suicide than most in this House. It's been great to have my right honourable friend, the member for Basingstoke, here as chairman of the Women and Equality Select Committee, and I certainly support her view that we need greater genuine gender equality. I'm very grateful for the presence of the honourable member for York, who spoke a lot about how this is an issue in her constituency, and as a good constituency MP, she was right to draw attention to how this particularly relates to issues in York. My honourable friend for Bury North, I'm very grateful for as member of the Backbench Business Committee who actually helped to grant this debate, and I was very struck by his point about how stubborn the levels of suicide have been over many years and how this is a difficult issue to tackle. My honourable friend for Derby North talked greatly about how we need to end the stigma around some of these issues, and I thought she spoke very powerfully about it too. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for Telford, who after her early criticisms of me, I thought went on to make a very good speech, but I'll forgive her that. She spoke about her son, who sounds like a hero to me. I very much hope to meet him sometime soon, and again spoke about her genuine belief in true gender equality. I can also echo the remarks of the Minister in that she shouldn't worry about Twitter at all. I've got 11,000 followers on Twitter, Mr Rosendale, and all of them hate me. So she certainly shouldn't worry about that. We were very grateful for the perspective from the SNP, for the Honourable Member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross about what the Scottish Executive are doing and how seriously they treat that issue. I'm sure we were all grateful for that before we went slightly off-piste on the work capability assessment, but we'll probably forgive him for that. The Shadow Minister spoke about how there was so much more to do in this issue, and I think, again, that's something that everyone in this debate would echo. And I think we all appreciate the commitment that the Minister has to this issue and how hard he works on trying to tackle this difficult issue. And I think he comprehensively covered everything that he's doing personally and the department's doing to try and tackle this particular issue. I should also mention, Mr Rosendale, before I close, that the debate was certainly enhanced by the contributions from my honourable friends, the members for Faversham and Mid-Kent, and Brigham Gaul and Christchurch and the Isle of Wight and Worcester, who all made passionate and important contributions to the debate. I certainly echo what my honourable friend from Worcester said about homelessness. I spent some time volunteering with a wonderful charity in Leeds called St George's Crypt, who do great work in that particular area, and I certainly echo the points that he made. And also the honourable member for Hayward and Middleton, who has also stayed here for the duration of the debate, which does an awful lot of credit as well. And I should also mention my honourable friends for Pudsey and Milton Keynes South, who have also sat and listened to the debate with great care, and we're very grateful for that too. One thing I want to just say before we conclude, Mr Rosendale, is that I don't agree with my honourable friend, the Minister, and the Honourable Lady for Bridgend about language and the word committed. I think this is one of the problems we have in our society and political correctness within it, in the sense that there are lots of people in this country who are petrified of saying anything in case somebody takes offence at it. I don't believe any word or phrase is offensive. It's the context in which it's used that makes it offensive, and the intention behind it that makes it offensive. And when people start taking offence when none was ever intended, that's when we get ourselves into terrible problems in this country, where people won't speak out about things lest somebody feels that somebody complains because they were offended by something. If people feel offence when none was intended, as far as I'm concerned, that's more their problem than the person who said it in the first place. So I can't agree with my honourable friend, the Honourable Lady for Bridgend, on that point. But I do think this has been a very important debate. I think we have raised issues that very rarely get discussed in the House of Commons. I think there are lots of people out in the country who are delighted that some of these issues have finally been raised. People who have been campaigning on these issues for years and years and years and not really getting the recognition that they deserve. And I think that we've done the country and the House a great service by actually debating these things. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful to the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate. They've shown why the Backbench Business Committee is so important in the House of Commons, and long may that continue. Thank you, Mr Rosendale.
The question is that this House has considered the matter of male suicide and International Men's Day. As many are of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.
Grand Committee Room ident. Grand Committee Room ident.